I was 48 years old when I learned that silence could be sharper than any word I might have spoken in my own defense. They wanted me to shout. They wanted me to break. They wanted me to storm out of that conference room with my fists clenched and my voice cracking, to give them the spectacle they'd already written into their narrative. But I didn't. I sat there in that leather chair, my hands folded on the table, my breathing slow and measured, and I watched them perform their little theater of accusation with the patience of a man who had already begun counting the days until their world collapsed. The conference room on the 14th floor had windows that overlooked the city, glass and steel stretching toward a sky that was always either too bright or too gray. I'd sat in that room hundreds of times over the past 11 years, budget meetings, strategy sessions, performance reviews where I'd watched lesser men promoted over me with smiles I'd perfected to hide what I actually thought. That room had witnessed my slow, unremarkable career at Meridian Solutions, a mid-tier consulting firm that billed itself as innovative but was really just competent enough to survive and small enough to be vicious. Marcus Caldwell sat at the head of the table. He was 52, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that came from weekend golf and the kind of confidence that came from never having been truly challenged. He'd been my boss for 6 years. Before that, we'd been colleagues, even something resembling friends, back when he was still hungry and I was still naive enough to believe that hard work and intelligence mattered more than politics and performance. "Tom," he said, and his voice had that practiced gentleness that people use when they're about to destroy you and want to seem compassionate while doing it. "I want you to know this isn't easy for any of us." I didn't respond. I kept my eyes on him, steady, unreactive. I could see it bothered him, that lack of reaction. He'd expected anger or denial or perhaps even tears. Men like Marcus needed your emotion to justify what they were doing. Without it, they were just bullies in expensive suits. Jennifer Shue sat to his left, head of HR, her laptop open in front of her like a shield. She was 39, efficient, and had mastered the art of seeming sympathetic while executing corporate cruelty with surgical precision. She'd hired me 11 years ago. I remember she'd told me I had potential. I wondered if she remembered that conversation, or if people like her simply discarded such memories once they became inconvenient. "The investigation has concluded," Marcus continued, glancing down at a folder in front of him. He didn't need to look at it. He'd memorized whatever script they'd prepared. "The evidence is clear. Financial irregularities in the Hamilton account, unauthorized access to confidential client data, and misrepresentation of project timelines to secure bonus payments. All of it traces back to your access credentials, your computer, your work product." The Hamilton account, of course. It was the largest contract I'd ever managed, a 3-year engagement worth $42 million. I'd built that relationship from nothing, had spent 18 months courting Hamilton Industries, understanding their needs, crafting solutions that actually solved their problems rather than just billing hours. It had been my masterpiece, the thing I thought might finally earn me the recognition I'd been chasing for over a decade. "I didn't do any of those things," I said quietly. Marcus sighed, and it was almost convincing, that sigh. Almost. "Tom, I know this is difficult to accept, but the evidence is fabricated," I interrupted, still quiet, still calm. "And you know it is." Something flickered across his face. Irritation, maybe, or perhaps just the annoyance of a man whose script had been disrupted. Jennifer's fingers stopped moving on her keyboard. The room fell into a silence that pressed against my eardrums. "That's a serious accusation," Jennifer said carefully. "Yes," I agreed. "It is." Marcus leaned back in his chair, and now I could see it clearly, the mask slipping just slightly. The calculation behind his eyes. He'd expected this to be simple, clean. A man caught with his hand in the till, ashamed and broken, accepting his fate with at least the dignity of silence. "Do you have any evidence to support that claim?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. It was the truth, but it was also a promise. I saw him hear it that way. I watched him process the implication, weigh it against whatever plan he'd constructed, and then dismiss it. That dismissal told me everything I needed to know about how confident he was, how thorough he believed he'd been. "Then I'm afraid we have no choice," Marcus said, and now the gentleness was gone from his voice. This was the real him, the one I'd watched emerge over the past 6 years as he'd climbed and I'd stagnated. "Effective immediately, your employment with Meridian Solutions is terminated for cause. You'll be escorted from the building. Your access has already been revoked. You'll receive information about Cobra and your 401k within 10 business days. If you attempt to contact any current clients or employees, we'll pursue legal action." Jennifer slid a folder across the table toward me. "Everything you need to know is in here. There's also a separation agreement. If you sign it, we'll provide 2 weeks of severance pay, which is more than generous given the circumstances. If you don't sign, we'll proceed with filing a police report regarding the financial irregularities." I looked down at the folder but didn't touch it. 2 weeks of severance in exchange for my silence and any future legal claims. It was an insult wrapped in a threat. They wanted me to take it because it meant I wouldn't fight, wouldn't investigate, wouldn't cause problems. The police report was likely a bluff. If they actually had evidence strong enough to prosecute, they wouldn't be offering me money to go away quietly. "I'm not signing anything today," I said. "Tom," Marcus started. "I'll have an attorney review it," I continued, standing up slowly. My knees ached. I'd been running every morning for the past 15 years, trying to outrun the slow decay of middle age. But lately my body had been reminding me that I was closer to 50 than 40, that time was not something I could negotiate with. "Is there anything else?" Jennifer and Marcus exchanged a glance. Some silent communication passed between them. Then Marcus nodded toward the door. "Security will escort you out." Right on cue, the door opened. Paul Hendricks stepped in, head of building security, a former cop who'd always been friendly to me in the elevator, who'd asked about my daughter every time he saw me. He wouldn't look at me now. That was how I knew they'd told him some version of the story, had poisoned the well before I even knew I needed to defend it. "This way, Mr. Morrison," Paul said quietly. I picked up the folder and walked toward the door. I didn't look back at Marcus or Jennifer. I didn't give them the satisfaction. But as I reached the threshold, I stopped and turned just my head, just enough to meet Marcus's eyes one more time. "You should have been more careful," I said softly. His expression didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten. Good. Let him wonder. Let him spend the next few days trying to figure out what I meant, what I might know, what I might have hidden away in case of exactly this moment. Let him worry. The walk through the office was designed to humiliate. Paul didn't handcuff me or anything so dramatic, but he stayed close, one hand near my elbow, his presence making it clear to everyone we passed that I was being removed, that I was in disgrace. Faces turned as I walked by. Some looked away quickly. Others stared with that horrible mix of curiosity and relief that comes from watching someone else's career implode instead of your own. I saw Derek Chen standing by the coffee machine, and our eyes met for just a second. Derek was 31, brilliant with data analysis, and had been on my team for the past 3 years. I'd mentored him, had fought to get him raises and recognition, had treated him like the younger colleague I wished I'd had when I was starting out. He looked away first. Not out of shame, I realized, out of guilt. That was when I knew for certain that this wasn't just Marcus. This was bigger. More people were involved. The fabrication had required access to systems, to my credentials, to information about my work patterns and habits. Derek would have had that access. Derek would have known how to make it look convincing. I filed that knowledge away in the same quiet place where I was filing everything else. Later. I would deal with all of it later. My office was small, a 10 by 12 box with a window that looked out at the building next door. 11 years and I'd never rated anything better. They'd already boxed up my personal belongings. Not everything, I noticed. Just the things that wouldn't create obvious questions. The photo of my daughter Rachel at her high school graduation, that was there. The small succulent plant she'd given me 2 Christmases ago, that was there. But the files I'd kept, the notes I'd accumulated on various projects, my backup drives, those were gone. "You've got 5 minutes, Paul said, hovering in the doorway. I picked up the box. It wasn't heavy. 11 years of my life reduced to a few pounds of sentiment. I wondered if they'd already gone through everything, if they'd found what they were looking for, if they even knew what to look for. I wondered if they understood yet that I'd been preparing for something like this, maybe not consciously, but with the instinct of a man who'd watched too many colleagues get sacrificed to corporate expediency over the years. The elevator ride down was silent. Paul stood beside me, probably trying to think of something to say that wouldn't make things worse. I didn't help him. We reached the lobby, and I walked out through the glass doors I'd walked through thousands of times before, and I knew I would never walk through them again as an employee of Meridian Solutions. My car was in the parking garage. They hadn't revoked that access yet, a small oversight that told me they'd rushed this. Rushed meant mistakes. Mistakes meant opportunities. I set the box in my trunk next to the emergency kit I'd had in there for 6 years and never needed, and I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the steering wheel, staring at the concrete wall in front of me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't slam my fists against the dashboard. I sat there and I breathed, slow and measured, and I began to think. My marriage had ended 8 years ago. Susan had been patient with my career for a while, had understood that I was building something, that the long hours and the stress and the disappointments were investments in a future that would eventually pay off. But there's a limit to patience, especially when the future keeps receding like a mirage. She'd met someone else, someone who was home for dinner, who didn't bring work stress into the bedroom, who smiled more easily. I didn't fight the divorce. What would have been the point? She was right to leave. I'd chosen my career over our marriage, and my career had given me nothing in return. Rachel lived with her mother but visited me every other weekend, though those visits had become less frequent once she'd started college 2 years ago. She was 20 now, studying environmental science at UC Boulder, and she called me every Sunday evening like clockwork because she was dutiful and kind, and because she worried about me in the way that children worry about parents who live alone and seem to be slowly disappearing into their work. I would have to tell her about this. The thought made my stomach turn, not because I was ashamed, I knew I was innocent, but because I could already hear the worry in her voice, could already see her trying to figure out how to help me while managing her own life hundreds of miles away. But first, I needed to understand what had happened, and why. I drove home to my apartment, a one-bedroom place in a building that was clean and functional and utterly without character. I'd moved there after the divorce and never bothered to move again. It was close to the office. Was. Past tense now. I'd have to start thinking in past tense about a lot of things. Inside, I set the box on the kitchen counter and made coffee. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. I had no job to return to, no meetings to prepare for, no deadlines to track. The sudden vastness of empty time felt almost physical, like walking into a room and finding all the furniture gone. I opened my laptop and checked my email. My work account was already deactivated. They'd been efficient about that, at least. But I had my personal email, and I had contacts, and I had 11 years of accumulated knowledge about how Meridian Solutions operated, about where the bodies were buried, about what Marcus Caldwell really was, beneath the veneer of professional competence. The Hamilton account irregularities they'd accused me of. I pulled up my personal records, the copies I'd made of important emails and documents over the years. Not because I'd been planning for this specifically, but because I'd learned early in my career that companies had short memories when it came to who had done what, and I'd wanted to protect my own work, my own contributions, from being erased or reassigned. I started reading. The Hamilton contract had been straightforward, monthly billing based on hours worked, with performance bonuses tied to specific deliverables. I'd managed a team of 6 people, including Derek, and we'd hit every milestone ahead of schedule. The client had been happy, so happy that they'd expanded the contract twice, adding new work streams that brought in additional revenue. Financial irregularities, that's what Marcus had said, money disappearing, presumably into my pocket somehow, but I'd never had signature authority on the account. That authority had belonged to Marcus himself, with Jennifer as the backup. I could request purchases, could approve timesheets for my team, but I couldn't move money. Not in any meaningful way. So how had they made it look like I had? I opened a spreadsheet and started mapping out the account structure. Who had access to what? Who approved what? Who could manipulate the records without leaving obvious fingerprints? It was meticulous work, the kind of detail-oriented analysis I'd always been good at, and as I worked I felt something cold and sharp beginning to form in my chest. Not anger, not yet, something more patient, more deliberate. My phone rang. I looked at the screen. Rachel. I almost didn't answer. I wasn't ready to tell her. Wasn't ready to hear the worry in her voice or field her questions or pretend I had any idea what I was going to do next. But she was my daughter, and she deserved better than me hiding from her. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice light. "Dad, you're home early." She sounded surprised. I was never home early. I was usually still at the office at 6, sometimes at 7 or 8. "Yeah, something came up. How are classes going?" "They're fine." "Dad, you sound weird. Is everything okay?" She'd always been able to read me, even over the phone. I considered lying, but I'd never lied to her about anything important, and I wasn't going to start now. "I lost my job today," I said. Silence on the other end. Then, carefully, what happened? "They accused me of financial misconduct. It's not true, but they terminated me anyway." "Oh my God. Dad, are you okay?" Do you need me to come home?" "No," I said quickly. "No, you have classes. I'm fine. I wanted you to hear it from me. This is insane. You've been there for, 11 years? Can they just fire you like that?" "They can if they believe they have cause, which they claim they do. But you didn't do anything." "No, I didn't." Another pause. I could hear her thinking, processing, trying to figure out what to say that would help. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to figure out who did this," I said. "And then I'm going to make sure they understand what a mistake they made." The coldness in my voice must have surprised her because she went quiet again. Then softly, "Dad, don't do anything crazy." "I won't," I promised. "I'm just going to be very, very careful." We talked for a few more minutes. She made me promise to keep her updated, to call if I needed anything, to not isolate myself. I made the promises because they made her feel better, but I knew I was already isolating myself. It was necessary. What I needed to do required focus, required the kind of single-minded attention that didn't leave room for maintaining appearances or managing other people's emotions. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and thought about Marcus Caldwell, about the way he'd looked at me in that conference room, about the calculated precision of the accusation. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. This was planned. But why? I'd never been a threat to Marcus. I'd been competent, reliable, and invisible. I'd done good work without demanding recognition. I'd made him look good by extension. So why frame me now? What had changed? I pulled up news about Meridian Solutions, searching for anything recent that might provide context. Most of it was routine. Client wins, employee promotions, the usual corporate self-congratulation. But then I found something interesting. 3 weeks ago, Meridian had announced a strategic partnership with Titan Consulting, a much larger firm. The partnership would allow Meridian to bid on bigger contracts, to expand into new markets, to grow beyond its current limitations. I read the announcement carefully. The partnership was contingent on Meridian demonstrating strong internal controls and financial integrity. Titan was acquiring a minority stake but wanted assurances that Meridian was clean, that there were no hidden liabilities, no scandals waiting to surface. And suddenly, it clicked. The Hamilton account had my fingerprints all over it, but the signature authority belonged to Marcus. If there had been actual financial misconduct, money disappearing, false billing, anything that might create liability, it would trace back to him. Unless he could manufacture a scapegoat. Unless he could create a narrative where someone else had abused their access, where the irregularities were the result of a rogue employee rather than systemic problems or executive-level theft. I was the scapegoat, and the timing just before the Titan partnership was finalized was perfect. Marcus could point to me as evidence that Meridian took internal controls seriously, that they acted swiftly and decisively when problems were discovered. He could turn his own potential liability into a demonstration of corporate integrity. It was almost elegant, and it would have worked perfectly if I'd signed that separation agreement and disappeared quietly. I opened a new document and started writing. Everything I knew, everything I suspected. Names, dates, access levels, approval chains. I documented the structure of the Hamilton account, the timeline of my termination relative to the Titan partnership announcement, the fact that I'd never had the authority to commit the kind of financial misconduct they were accusing me of. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a foundation, a map of where to look and what to look for. I worked through the evening and into the night, barely aware of time passing. Around midnight, I stopped and made myself eat something, a sandwich that tasted like cardboard because I wasn't really paying attention to it. Then I went back to work. By 3 a.m, I had a list of people I needed to talk to, former colleagues who'd left Meridian over the years, clients I'd worked with who might be willing to provide statements about the quality and integrity of my work, an attorney who specialized in employment law, a friend of a friend who'd helped someone I knew navigate a wrongful termination case 5 years ago. I also had a list of vulnerabilities. Things Marcus probably hadn't considered. Small details about how the systems worked, about who had access to what, about the digital fingerprints that couldn't be easily erased even if you thought you'd covered your tracks. Derek Chen's guilty look kept coming back to me. Derek was the key. He was the only one on my team with the technical skills to fabricate the kind of evidence they'd need. He was young enough to be manipulated, ambitious enough to be tempted, and smart enough to do it well. But Derek was also fundamentally decent. I'd seen that in the 3 years we'd worked together. He cared about doing good work. He cared about fairness. Whatever they'd offered him or told him to convince him to participate in this, it must have been substantial. Or frightening. I needed to talk to Derek. but I needed to be smart about it. If I approached him directly, he'd panic, would run straight to Marcus, and I'd lose whatever small advantage I currently had. I needed leverage first. Information. Proof that would make Derek understand that he was on the wrong side of this, that his loyalty to Marcus was misplaced, that he was being used just as much as I was. I closed my laptop and finally let myself feel it, the exhaustion, the anger that had been building behind the cold analytical focus, the betrayal. I'd given 11 years to Meridian Solutions. I'd sacrificed my marriage, had missed countless moments with my daughter, had poured my intelligence and creativity and effort into building something I thought mattered. And they'd discarded me like I was nothing, like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person who'd earned at least the basic dignity of honesty. I wanted to hurt them. Wanted to watch Marcus's career implode the way mine just had. Wanted to see Jennifer squirm under the scrutiny of an investigation. Wanted Derek to understand the enormity of what he'd done. But wanting wasn't enough. Wanting was just emotion, and emotion without strategy was useless. I needed to be smarter than they were, more patient, more thorough. I needed to be the person they'd underestimated, the invisible, competent, reliable man they thought they could sacrifice without consequence. I went to bed as the sky was beginning to lighten, and I slept dreamlessly for 4 hours. When I woke, I made coffee and returned to my laptop. The separation agreement they'd given me required a response within 7 days. I had 7 days to build a case, to find leverage, to transform myself from victim to threat. It didn't feel like enough time, but it would have to be. I started with the attorney. His name was Robert Park, and he came recommended by a former colleague who'd successfully sued her previous employer for age discrimination. I called his office at 9 a.m. and explained my situation in broad strokes. He agreed to meet with me that afternoon. His office was in a converted brownstone in a neighborhood that had been gentrifying for the past decade. Inside, it was cluttered but organized, shelves full of legal texts and case files, a desk covered in papers that somehow seemed purposeful rather than chaotic. Robert himself was in his mid-50s, Korean-American with graying hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Tell me everything," he said after we'd shaken hands, and I'd sat down across from him. I did. The termination meeting, the accusations, the separation agreement and its implied threats, the Hamilton account structure and my suspicions about Marcus, the timing relative to the Titan partnership, everything I documented the night before. Robert listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he sat back and looked at me thoughtfully. "You understand that this is going to be difficult," he said. "Wrongful termination cases are hard to prove even when the facts are clearly on your side. And if they've fabricated evidence as thoroughly as you believe, we're going to need to unravel that fabrication piece by piece. I understand. It's also going to be expensive. I can work with you on payment, but this kind of case requires hundreds of hours. Discovery, depositions, expert witnesses if we need to demonstrate that the evidence was manufactured. We're looking at 6 months minimum, possibly longer." "I don't care how long it takes," he studied me for a moment. "You're angry. Yes, that's understandable, but anger isn't a strategy. I need you to think very carefully about what you want out of this. Do you want your job back? Do you want financial compensation? Do you want to punish the people who did this to you? Because those are different goals and they require different approaches." I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. What did I want? My job back at a company that had betrayed me? That seemed pointless. Money? I had savings, could probably find another position eventually, so financial desperation wasn't driving this. Punishment? Yes, that was closest to the truth. I wanted them to face consequences. I wanted Marcus to experience even a fraction of what he'd put me through. I wanted Derek to understand that actions had repercussions. I wanted the organization to acknowledge that what they'd done was wrong. I want justice, I said. I want the truth to come out, and I want them to understand that they can't do this to people without cost. Robert nodded slowly. Justice is a good goal. Truth is even better. But you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that we might not get either of those things. The legal system doesn't always work the way we want it to. Sometimes the bad guys win. Sometimes the best outcome is a settlement where you get some money and they admit no wrongdoing. I know. Do you? Because a lot of people say they know, but then they're devastated when reality doesn't match their expectations. I met his eyes. I've spent 11 years in a career that taught me that fairness is an illusion and that competence doesn't protect you from politics. I know how the world works, but I'm not going to accept this quietly just because the system is broken. I'm going to fight. And if I lose, at least I'll lose knowing I tried. Something in his expression shifted. A small smile. Okay, then let's figure out how to win. We spent the next 2 hours going through my documentation, identifying what we had and what we needed. Robert explained the legal process, the timeline, the costs. He agreed to take my case on a partial contingency basis. I'd pay a reduced hourly rate up front, and he'd take a percentage of any settlement or judgment we eventually won. First step is to respond to their separation agreement, he said. We'll decline to sign and we'll request copies of all the evidence they claim to have. They're required to provide it during discovery, but if we can get them to share some of it now, it might give us insight into how they constructed their narrative. They'll refuse, probably. But it costs us nothing to ask, and their refusal goes on the record. What about the criminal charges they threatened? Empty threat, most likely. If they had evidence strong enough for criminal prosecution, they'd have gone to the police already. The threat was designed to scare you into signing. But we'll prepare a defense just in case. I have a criminal attorney I work with who can consult if needed. I left Robert's office feeling something I hadn't felt since walking out of Meridian Solutions. Purpose. I still had no job, no income, no clear path forward. But I had an attorney, I had a strategy, and I had something to work toward. Over the next 3 days, I became a different version of myself. The man who'd spent 11 years being competent and invisible began to shed that skin, and what emerged beneath was colder, sharper, more focused. I stopped shaving, stopped caring about what I wore. I lived in my apartment like it was a command center, walls covered with notes and timelines, my laptop always open, my phone always nearby. I reached out to former colleagues carefully, obliquely, just checking in, seeing how they were doing, mentioning casually that I'd left Meridian and was exploring options. Some of them had heard rumors. The story was already circulating. Financial misconduct, terminated for cause, escorted from the building. The efficiency with which my reputation was being destroyed was almost impressive. But not everyone believed it. A few people who'd worked with me closely enough to know my character, expressed skepticism. One of them, a woman named Patricia, who'd been on my team 4 years ago before leaving for a better opportunity, told me bluntly that it sounded like corporate politics and that I should lawyer up. Marcus has always been ambitious, she said during our phone call. And you know what? He's always been just a little too clean, like someone who's very good at making sure nothing sticks to him. I wouldn't be surprised if he's been setting this up for a while. Why do you say that? Because I saw him do something similar to Greg Chen 3 years ago. You remember Greg? I did. Greg had been a senior consultant, one of the few people at Meridian who'd been more senior than Marcus at the time. He'd left abruptly, and the official story had been mutual agreement, a parting of ways. But there had been rumors of impropriety, of conflicts of interest. Greg took a contract with one of our competitors after he left, Patricia continued. But before he left, there were whispers about him trying to steal clients, about ethics violations. Marcus was the one who raised the concerns. And looking back, it all seemed very convenient that the main obstacle to Marcus's promotion suddenly had a cloud over his reputation. Did Greg ever fight it? I don't think so. He just moved on, got a good position elsewhere, and left it alone. That was the pattern then. Identify a threat or an obstacle, manufacture a scandal, let the target choose between fighting a losing battle or quietly disappearing. Most people chose to disappear. It was rational. It was easier. It protected what remained of their career and reputation. But I wasn't going to disappear. Because I understood now that this wasn't just about me. This was about a pattern of behavior, about a man who'd built his career on sacrificing other people. And if I didn't stop him, he'd do it again. To someone else. To the next person who became inconvenient or who stood in the way of whatever Marcus wanted next. On the 5th day after my termination, Derek Chen sent me an email. It came to my personal address late at night, and it was brief. Tom, I'm sorry, I didn't want this. Can we talk? I stared at that message for 10 minutes, weighing options. Derek was scared. Derek was feeling guilty. Derek might be ready to flip, to tell me what had really happened, to provide the inside information I needed to build my case. Or Derek was being used again. Sent by Marcus to gauge what I knew, what I was planning, whether I was going to be a problem. I needed to talk to him. But I needed to control the circumstances. I needed Derek to feel safe enough to be honest, but cornered enough to understand that lying wouldn't help him. I replied, coffee tomorrow, 2 p.m., the place on 8th Street near my apartment. Come alone. He responded almost immediately. Okay. That night, I barely slept. I ran through scenarios, conversations, possible revelations. I thought about what I would say, how I would read Derek's responses, what leverage I might be able to create. I thought about the person I was becoming, this cold, calculating version of myself who was willing to manipulate a young man I'd once mentored in order to bring down people who'd wronged me. I wondered if Rachel would recognize this version of her father, if Susan would be surprised, or if she'd say she'd always known this capacity for ruthlessness lived somewhere inside me, waiting for the right provocation to emerge. At 1:30 the next afternoon, I walked to the coffee shop. It was a small place, independently owned, the kind of establishment that was becoming increasingly rare as chains devoured everything. I ordered black coffee and sat at a table in the back where I could see the door. Derek arrived exactly at 2. He looked terrible, circles under his eyes, rumpled shirt, the posture of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. He saw me and hesitated for just a second before walking over. "Thanks for meeting me," he said quietly, sitting down across from me. "You said you wanted to talk," I replied. My voice was neutral. I wasn't going to make this easy for him. He stopped, looked down at his hands. "I need you to know I didn't want any of this to happen, but it did happen, and you helped make it happen." He flinched. "Marcus said it was necessary. He said you'd been skimming from the Hamilton account, that the evidence was clear, that if we didn't act quickly, the whole company could be liable. He made it sound like we were protecting everyone. And you believed him. I didn't want to believe him. But he showed me things, transactions, access logs, emails. It all looked real. It looked real because you helped make it look real," I said. "You have the skills. You have the access. So what did Marcus promise you? A promotion? A bonus? Or did he threaten you?" Derek's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the table. "Both. He said if I helped, I'd be brought into a new role, senior analyst, more money, more responsibility. And he said if I didn't help, if I questioned what was happening, he'd make sure I went down with you. He said there was evidence that could implicate me too, that I'd worked closely enough with you that I could be seen as either a co-conspirator or a whistleblower, and that the choice was mine." There it was, the same playbook. Create a narrative, offer a carrot, threaten with a stick, force people to choose between their conscience and their survival. "So you chose survival," I said. "I chose wrong," Derek said, and now his voice cracked. "I know I chose wrong. I've been trying to live with it for the past week, and I can't. I can't sleep. I can't work. I look at myself in the mirror, and I don't recognize who I see." I let the silence stretch. Let him sit in his guilt and his fear. Finally, I leaned forward slightly. "Tell me everything," I said. "How it was done, who was involved, what evidence actually exists, and what was fabricated. Tell me all of it, and maybe we can find a way through this where you don't lose everything." He looked up at me, hope and terror mixing in his expression. "If I tell you, if I testify or whatever, Marcus will destroy me. He'll make sure I never work in this industry again." "Marcus is going to destroy you anyway," I said quietly. "You're a witness to what he did. You're a loose end. The only question is whether you're a loose end who helps him or a loose end who helps me. At least if you help me, there's a chance we both come out of this alive." I didn't know if that was true, but I said it with enough conviction that Derek seemed to believe it. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and started talking. The coffee in my cup had gone cold by the time Derek finished explaining how they'd framed me. He spoke in a low voice, hunched over the table, his words coming out in irregular bursts, detailed technical explanations followed by long pauses where he seemed to be gathering courage to continue. I didn't interrupt. I barely moved. I just absorbed every word and filed it away in the part of my mind that was keeping track of every weapon I could use against Marcus Caldwell. The fabrication had been sophisticated. Derek walked me through it piece by piece, his voice tight with shame and anxiety. They'd started with my legitimate access to the Hamilton account systems, then created a shadow set of transactions that mirrored real billing, but with subtle alterations. Money that should have gone into Meridian's operating account had been redirected to a series of intermediate accounts before landing back where it belonged, but the digital trail made it look like I'd orchestrated the detours. "The intermediate accounts," Derek said, staring at his untouched coffee. "Marcus set those up. He has a cousin who works in finance, someone who knows how to create shell entities that look legitimate on paper, but don't really exist in any meaningful way. The accounts were active for just long enough to create the appearance of a pattern, then they were dissolved, but the logs showing your credentials accessing the transfer systems, those were fabricated. I wrote a script that could insert false authentication records into the backup logs." "The backups," I said, "not the primary systems." He nodded miserably. The primary systems would have been too risky. Too many safeguards, too many people with oversight. But the backup systems? Those are managed by a third-party vendor. And the security is good enough to pass audits, but not sophisticated enough to catch someone who knows what they're looking for. I created entries that showed your login credentials being used to authorize the transfers. To anyone doing a forensic review, it would look like you'd accessed the system, moved the money, and tried to cover your tracks. Except I never had authorization to move money at all. I know. That's the part that's been eating at me. Anyone who actually understood how the account was structured would see that immediately. But Marcus was betting that nobody would look that closely. He was betting on the narrative. Senior consultant gets greedy, takes advantage of his position, gets caught. It's a story people want to believe because it confirms what they already think about corporate culture. He wasn't wrong. People were predisposed to believe that someone had been stealing, that white-collar crime beneath every professional veneer was someone looking for an angle. The story Marcus had constructed fit comfortably into existing assumptions, which made it much harder to challenge. "What about Jennifer?" I asked. "How involved is she?" Derek shifted uncomfortably. "She knows. I don't think she was involved in creating the evidence, but Marcus brought her in early to handle the HR side. She helped craft the termination strategy, made sure the separation agreement was structured to protect the company. She's been in meetings with Marcus planning how to present this to Titan when they do their due diligence. So she's complicit, yes, but I think she's also scared. Marcus has something on her too. I don't know what, but I've seen the way she acts around him, like she's afraid of him." That was interesting. Jennifer Shu had always seemed untouchable, one of those HR executives who wielded power through procedure and policy. But if Marcus had leverage over her, if she was trapped in the same kind of coercive dynamic that had ensnared Derek, then maybe she could be turned. Or at least, maybe her fear could be exploited. "Who else knows?" I asked. "Paul Hendricks suspects something's wrong. Security wasn't brought in on the details, but Paul's not stupid. He asked me about it the day after you were escorted out, said something felt off about the whole thing. I think he might be willing to talk if someone asked the right questions." I filed that away. Paul had been friendly to me for years, had shown me photos of his grandkids, had treated me like a human being rather than just another employee. If he was suspicious, if he could be persuaded to look at the evidence with fresh eyes, he might become an ally. "What about the actual money?" I asked. "The funds that were supposedly misappropriated, where did they actually go?" Derek's expression darkened. "That's the thing. There was no money missing. The entire scheme was smoke and mirrors. The intermediate accounts made it look like funds were being diverted, but if you actually track the money from beginning to end, every dollar that Hamilton Industries paid to Meridian ended up exactly where it was supposed to be. The fabrication was purely about creating the appearance of impropriety, not about actual theft." I sat back, processing that. It made sense. Actually stealing money would create real victims, real financial discrepancy that auditors would eventually catch. But creating the appearance of theft without the reality, that was clever. It gave Marcus the narrative he needed without creating actual liability for the company. "So the evidence against me is entirely fabricated," I said. "The authentication logs are false. The intermediate accounts were created specifically to frame me. And there's no actual financial loss." "Yes. Can you prove it?" Derek went very still. This was the question he'd been dreading. "I can prove I created the false authentication logs. I still have the scripts I wrote, and I can demonstrate how they work. But proving that Marcus orchestrated everything? That's harder." He was careful. Everything was verbal instructions, private meetings. He never sent emails or left documentation that could be traced back to him. "What about the shell accounts? You said his cousin set those up? I never met the cousin. I don't even know his name. Marcus just told me the accounts existed and gave me the routing information when I needed it." That was a problem. Without a clear chain of evidence connecting Marcus to the fabrication, it became my word against his. And in that contest, Marcus had the institutional power, the position, the presumption of credibility. But Derek's testimony was still valuable. It proved the evidence against me had been manufactured. It proved there had been a conspiracy. It might not be enough to destroy Marcus immediately, but it was enough to create reasonable doubt, to force a real investigation, to make Titan Consulting think twice about their partnership with Meridian. "I'm going to need you to provide all of this to my attorney," I said. "The scripts you wrote, a detailed timeline of what Marcus asked you to do and when, everything you can remember, about the meetings, the instructions, the threats he made." Derek's face went pale. Tom, if I do that. If you don't do that, you're going to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder waiting for Marcus to decide you're a liability, I interrupted. You're already a loose end. The only question is whether you're a loose end who helps him get away with this, or a loose end who helps bring him down. He'll ruin me. He'll make sure I never work again. He's going to try to ruin you either way. But if you help me, if you tell the truth, you at least have a chance. Whistleblowers have legal protections. We can argue you were coerced, that you came forward as soon as you understood the full scope of what was happening. It's not perfect, but it's better than staying silent and hoping Marcus doesn't turn on you when it becomes convenient. I could see him struggling with it, see the war between self-preservation and conscience playing out across his features. He was 31 years old. His career was just beginning. The thought of throwing it away to help someone else must have felt impossible. But I also knew that Derek was fundamentally decent. That was why Marcus had needed to coerce him rather than simply recruit him. That was why Derek had sent me that email, why he'd agreed to meet me, why he was sitting here now with his hands shaking and his voice cracking. Think about it, I said, softening my tone slightly. You don't have to decide right now, but think about what kind of person you want to be. Think about whether you can live with yourself if you let Marcus get away with this. And think about whether you really believe he's going to protect you when he's already shown you what he's willing to do to people who work for him. Derek nodded slowly. He looked exhausted, hollowed out by stress and guilt. How long do I have? My attorney is filing a response to the separation agreement in 2 days. If you're going to help, I need your statement before then. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it needs to be detailed enough to demonstrate that the evidence against me was fabricated. 2 days. 2 days. He stood up, his coffee still untouched on the table. I'm sorry, Tom. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am sorry. Sorry doesn't matter, I said quietly. What you do next is what matters. He left without another word. I watched him walk out of the coffee shop, his shoulders hunched like he was carrying something too heavy to bear. Maybe he was. Maybe we all were. I sat there for a long time after he was gone, thinking about leverage and trust and the strange moral calculus of using someone's guilt against them for a greater purpose. Was I being manipulative? Absolutely. Was I being unfair to Derek, who was as much a victim of Marcus's coercion as I was? Probably, but I was also being practical. I needed Derek's testimony. I needed the proof that the evidence against me had been manufactured. And if exploiting his conscience was what it took to get that proof, then I would do it without hesitation. That realization should have bothered me more than it did. The old version of myself, the one who'd existed a week ago, would have been troubled by the coldness of that calculation. But the old version of myself had been destroyed in that conference room on the 14th floor, and what remained was something harder, something willing to do what was necessary. I called Robert Park and told him about the conversation. He listened carefully, asking sharp questions about specifics, about what Derek could and couldn't prove. If he provides a statement, it changes everything, Robert said. It's no longer a he said, she said about your conduct. It becomes a question of corporate conspiracy, fabricated evidence, wrongful termination. We go from defending you to prosecuting them. Assuming Derek follows through. Yes, assuming that. He sounds scared. He is scared. But he's also eaten up with guilt. I think he'll do the right thing. You're betting a lot on that. I'm betting on the fact that Derek Chen is a better person than Marcus Caldwell. And I think that's a safe bet. Robert was quiet for a moment. You know, most people in your situation would be focused on getting a settlement and moving on. You could probably get a decent payout just on the threat of litigation, especially with the Titan partnership at stake. Meridian won't want any negative publicity right now. I don't want a settlement, I said. I know. I'm just making sure you understand what you're choosing. This is the hard path. This is the path that takes months, maybe years, that costs you time and money and emotional energy. This is the path that might not end the way you want it to. I understand. Okay, then. Let me know when Derek provides his statement. In the meantime, I'm going to start drafting our response to the separation agreement and begin the process of requesting their evidence through pre-litigation discovery. I spent the rest of the day in my apartment, refining my documentation, building out my timeline, identifying every point where Marcus's story didn't quite hold together. The work was meticulous and exhausting, but it gave me something to focus on, something to do with the rage and helplessness that kept threatening to overwhelm me. Rachel called that evening. We'd been talking every day since I told her about the termination, and I could hear the worry in her voice every time. How are you holding up? she asked. I'm okay. Busy. Working on building my case. Dad, I've been thinking, maybe I should take a semester off, come home, help you through this. Absolutely not, I said firmly. You have 1 more year of school. You need to finish, but you're going through this alone. I'm fine, Rachel. I have an attorney. I have a plan. And I need you to focus on your life, not on trying to fix mine. She was quiet for a moment. You sound different. Different how? I don't know. Harder, maybe. Like you're made of something colder than you used to be. She wasn't wrong. I wondered if that change was permanent, if whatever I was becoming in response to this crisis would remain after the crisis was resolved. I wondered if I would ever be able to go back to being the man who'd walked into that conference room a week ago. I'm just focused, I told her. This is important. I need to see it through. I know. I don't want you to lose yourself in this. I don't want you to become so consumed with getting revenge that you forget about everything else. It's not revenge, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. It's justice. Sometimes those look the same. Maybe they do, but I still need to pursue it. We talked for a few more minutes, carefully avoiding the topic that was consuming all my attention, instead discussing her classes and her friends and the paper she was writing on climate change and ecosystem collapse. Normal things. Things that felt very far away from my current reality. After we hung up, I sat in the darkness of my apartment and thought about what she'd said. Was I losing myself in this? Was I becoming someone I wouldn't recognize, someone my daughter wouldn't recognize? Probably. But I didn't know how to stop. The momentum had its own force now, carrying me forward whether I wanted it to or not. The next day, Derek sent me an email with a PDF attached. The subject line read simply, "My statement." I opened it with my heart pounding. 15 pages, single-spaced, detailed, technical, damning. Derek had included everything. The timeline of Marcus's requests, the technical specifications of how he'd fabricated the authentication logs, the coercive nature of Marcus's threats, the structure of the shell accounts, everything. It wasn't perfect. There were gaps in the chain of evidence, places where Derek's knowledge ended and Marcus's orchestration began. But it was enough. More than enough. I forwarded it to Robert Park immediately, then called him to make sure he'd received it. "This is good," Robert said after a few minutes of reading. "This is very good. With this, we can argue that not only were you wrongfully terminated, but that the termination was based on knowingly fabricated evidence. That opens them up to significant liability." What happens next? I send our response to their separation agreement, along with a demand letter. We lay out that we have evidence the accusations against you were manufactured, that we have a witness willing to testify to that effect, and that we're prepared to file a lawsuit alleging wrongful termination, defamation, and conspiracy to defraud. We give them 10 days to respond with a settlement offer, or we proceed with litigation. They'll lawyer up? Of course they will. But they'll also panic. The Titan partnership is supposed to close in less than 2 months. If word gets out that Meridian's leadership fabricated evidence to fire an employee, Titan will walk away. Marcus Caldwell knows that. Jennifer Shue knows that. So now we wait and see how desperate they are to make this go away, quietly. And if they don't settle, if they call our bluff, then it's not a bluff anymore. We file the lawsuit and we go to war. Robert sent the demand letter that afternoon. I got a copy of it via email and read it 3 times, savoring the language, the precision with which it dismantled Marcus's narrative and laid out the case against him. It felt like the first real blow I'd landed, the first moment where I'd shifted from being a victim to being a threat. Now came the waiting. I tried to occupy myself with job searching, updating my resume, reaching out to contacts in the industry, but my heart wasn't in it. The truth was that I didn't want another job. Not yet. Not until this was resolved. I couldn't imagine sitting in another conference room, working for another company, pretending to care about quarterly projections and client deliverables when my entire sense of professional identity had been violated. Besides, word had spread. The industry wasn't that large, and people talked. I could see it in the responses I got to my inquiries, polite but distant, interested but cautious. Nobody wanted to hire someone with a cloud of financial misconduct hanging over them, even if the accusations were unproven. Marcus had poisoned my reputation efficiently and thoroughly. Even if I won my case, even if the truth came out completely, there would always be people who remembered the accusation more clearly than the exoneration. 3 days after Robert sent the demand letter, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Tom Morrison? A woman's voice, professional but strained. Yes, this is Jennifer Shu. I think we need to talk. My grip tightened on the phone. I don't think we have anything to talk about. You should direct any communication through my attorney. Please, she said, and there was something in her voice that made me pause. Fear, real palpable fear. Please, just give me 10 minutes, not as HR. As someone who made a mistake and wants to fix it. I should have said no. I should have hung up and called Robert immediately. But curiosity won out over caution. 10 minutes, I said. I'm recording this call. That's fine. I expected you would be... She took a breath. I read the demand letter your attorney sent. I know what Derek told you. And I need you to know that Marcus is planning something. I don't know exactly what, but he's been in meetings all day with corporate counsel and with some outside consultant. They're building a response. And whatever it is, it's not going to be a settlement offer. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired of being complicit in his bullshit, she said, and the sudden rawness in her voice was startling. I've spent 6 years watching Marcus destroy people's careers to advance his own, and I've helped him do it because I was scared of what would happen if I didn't. But I'm done. I'm so fucking done. What does he have on you? Silence. Then, quietly, 4 years ago, I was in a relationship with someone who reported to me. It was stupid and unethical, and it violated company policy. We ended it before it became serious, and nobody ever knew. Except Marcus found out somehow. He's been holding it over me ever since. Nothing explicit, just little comments here and there reminding me that he knows. That if I ever became a problem, he could use it. That's not enough to destroy your career. Maybe not. But it would be enough to create questions, to damage my credibility, to make my job untenable. And Marcus knows that. He knows exactly how much leverage he needs to keep people in line. I believed her. It fit the pattern. Marcus didn't need overwhelming evidence or devastating secrets. He just needed enough to make people feel vulnerable, to make them choose cooperation over resistance. So what do you want from me? I asked. I want to help. I don't know how much use I can be, but I have access to documents, to communications. I know how the company operates. I can provide context, testimony, whatever you need. In exchange for what? Immunity, or at least consideration. I know I'm complicit in what happened to you. I know I deserve consequences. But I want a chance to make it right, and I want protection from Marcus's retaliation. This was unexpected. Jennifer Shu flipping was huge. She could corroborate Derek's testimony, could provide insight into Marcus's methods and motivations, could demonstrate a pattern of coercive behavior. But she was also a risk. She could be working with Marcus, could be trying to gather information about my case, could be setting some kind of trap. I need to talk to my attorney, I said. Of course. But Tom, whatever you decide, be careful. Marcus is dangerous, not physically, but he's ruthless in ways people don't see until it's too late. He's going to come after you harder now that you've fought back. Don't underestimate him. I won't. She hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. Then I called Robert. Jennifer Shu wants to flip, I told him. The HR director? Yes. She says Marcus has been blackmailing her, that she wants to help our case in exchange for immunity. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Could be legitimate, could be a trap. We need to be very careful about how we handle this. If she's genuine, she's incredibly valuable. If she's working with them, she could sabotage everything. How do we verify her intentions? We ask for something concrete. Documents, recordings, something that would be valuable to our case, but that she could only provide if she was genuinely turning against Marcus. We don't accept her help on faith. We make her prove she's serious. What do I tell her? Tell her we're willing to talk, but she needs to provide evidence of her good faith first, something that demonstrates she's actually willing to burn bridges with Meridian. If she does that, we'll consider some kind of agreement. I called Jennifer back and relayed Robert's conditions. She agreed without hesitation. Give me 2 days, she said. I'll get you something that proves I'm serious. 2 days later, an envelope arrived at Robert's office via courier. Inside was a flash drive containing email correspondence between Marcus and Jennifer spanning 3 years. The emails were damning, discussions of how to handle problem employees, references to the leverage Marcus had over various people, plans for restructuring that conveniently removed anyone who might challenge Marcus's authority. There was also an email thread about me, dated 3 months before my termination. Marcus had written to Jennifer asking her to start building a documentation file on me. to note any minor performance issues or policy violations, to create a paper trail that could be used to justify termination if it became necessary. "Why would you do this?" Jennifer had written back. "Tom's been a solid performer for years." Marcus's response was chilling in its casualness. "He's too close to the Hamilton account, knows too much about how we structure billing. If Titan does deep due diligence, I need to be able to distance the company from anyone who might raise uncomfortable questions. Better to have the option, even if we don't use it." Robert and I read through the emails together in his office. With each one, I felt the anger building, not the hot, explosive kind, but something colder and more sustainable. This hadn't been about anything I'd done wrong. This had been about Marcus protecting himself, about eliminating anyone who might threaten his carefully constructed narrative. "This is excellent," Robert said. "This shows premeditation. This shows Marcus was planning to terminate you months before the actual accusations were fabricated. Combined with Derek's technical testimony and Jennifer's insider knowledge of how Marcus operates, we have a very strong case. Do we offer her immunity? We offer her cooperation. We tell her that if she provides full testimony, if she's willing to be deposed and potentially to testify at trial, we'll present her to Meridian's counsel as a cooperating witness who is coerced rather than a willing participant. That should be enough to protect her job, at minimum. The rest depends on how the company chooses to handle it." That evening, I allowed myself a moment of something that felt almost like hope. Not optimism, exactly. I wasn't naive enough to think this was over, but for the first time since that conference room on the 14th floor, I felt like I had a real chance. Not just to clear my name, but to hold Marcus accountable for what he'd done. I called Rachel to update her. She listened quietly as I explained the developments, the way the case was building, the witnesses who were coming forward. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said when I finished. "For what?" "For fighting. For not just accepting what they did to you. I know it would have been easier to take the settlement and move on. It's not about easy or hard. It's about what's right. I know. But a lot of people wouldn't do what you're doing. They'd be too scared or too tired or too beaten down. The fact that you're still fighting says something about who you are." After we hung up, I thought about that, about who I was, about who I was becoming. The man I'd been 2 weeks ago felt like a stranger now, someone soft and naive and willing to accept injustice as long as it happened to someone else. This version of myself was harder, colder, more willing to use people and manipulate situations and do whatever was necessary to win. I wasn't sure which version was better, or if either of them was actually the real me, or if the real me was something that existed in between, some average of all the versions I'd been across all the contexts and pressures of my life. But I knew this. I was going to see this through. Whatever it cost, whatever it turned me into. Marcus Caldwell had made a mistake when he'd chosen me as his scapegoat. He'd assumed I was someone who would accept defeat quietly, who would slink away and rebuild elsewhere, who would choose self-preservation over justice. He'd been wrong, and now I was going to teach him exactly how wrong he'd been. The next week brought a flurry of activity. Robert filed the lawsuit: wrongful termination, defamation, conspiracy to commit fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The filing was public record, which meant it was immediately picked up by industry blogs and news sites. Former Meridian Solutions employee alleges corporate conspiracy in wrongful termination suit, read one headline. Consulting firm faces lawsuit over fabricated evidence, read another. The publicity was exactly what Marcus had been trying to avoid. I knew from contacts still at the company that the Titan Consulting partnership had been put on hold, pending the resolution of the litigation. I knew that Marcus had been called into emergency meetings with the board. I knew that the carefully constructed narrative he'd built was starting to crack under scrutiny. But Marcus wasn't going down without a fight. 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, Meridian's attorneys filed their response. They denied everything. They claimed the evidence against me was authentic, that Derek's testimony was coerced by me, that Jennifer was disgruntled and unreliable. They filed a countersuit alleging that I had indeed misappropriated funds and that my lawsuit was a malicious attempt to cover up my own misconduct. It was aggressive, it was nasty, and it meant we were going to trial. "This is good," Robert told me when we reviewed their response. "They're scared. If they weren't, they'd be trying to settle quietly. The fact that they're fighting means they think they can't afford to let the truth come out. Or it means they think they can win. Maybe, But they're making mistakes. Look at this. He pointed to a section of their filing. They claim the authentication logs are authentic and that Derek's assertion that he fabricated them is false. But that's an objectively provable claim. We can have an independent forensic examiner review the logs and demonstrate that they were manipulated. Once we prove that, their entire defense falls apart. How long will that take? Months. Discovery, depositions, expert testimony. This is going to be a long fight, Tom. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my dwindling savings, about the job prospects that were evaporating as the lawsuit became public, about the stress and uncertainty of months or years of legal battles. I thought about the person I was becoming, the hardness that was settling into my bones, the cold calculation that had replaced what used to be empathy and patience. Yes, I said. I'm prepared, and I was. Because this wasn't just about me anymore. This was about everyone Marcus had hurt, everyone he would hurt in the future if he wasn't stopped. This was about making sure that power without accountability didn't go unchallenged. This was about proving that sometimes silence wasn't wisdom and acceptance wasn't strength. Sometimes the only right thing to do was fight, even if the fight destroyed you, even if you won the battle but lost yourself in the process. I was prepared for that too. The deposition took place in a conference room that felt deliberately designed to be uncomfortable. Harsh fluorescent lighting, chairs that were slightly too hard, a temperature that was slightly too cold. Robert had warned me this was intentional. Opposing counsel wanted me off balance, wanted me irritated and defensive, wanted me to make mistakes. I'd been preparing for 3 weeks. Hours of practice sessions with Robert, going over every detail of my employment at Meridian, every transaction on the Hamilton account, every interaction with Marcus and Derek and Jennifer. Robert had played the role of hostile attorney, asking questions designed to trap me, to make me contradict myself, to expose weaknesses in my story. The key is to stay calm, he told me repeatedly. Don't get defensive. Don't elaborate beyond what's asked. Answer the question directly and then stop talking. They're going to try to provoke you. Don't let them. Now I sat across from Marcus Caldwell's attorney, a woman named Diane Rothstein, who had a reputation for being brilliant and ruthless in equal measure. She was in her 50s, expensively dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from winning more often than losing. Next to her sat a younger associate, a man whose job seemed to be primarily to look intimidating and take notes. Marcus wasn't present. Neither was Jennifer or Derek. This was just me, Robert, Diane, her associate, and a court reporter who would be transcribing every word. Let's begin, Diane said, her voice professionally pleasant. Mr. Morrison, please state your full name for the record. Thomas Andrew Morrison, and you were employed by Meridian Solutions from March 2014 to December 2024. Is that correct? Yes. During that time, what was your highest position? Senior consultant, and you reported directly to Marcus Caldwell? For the last 6 years of my employment, yes. She walked me through my employment history, my responsibilities, the structure of the teams I'd managed, softball questions designed to establish basic facts. But I knew she was also calibrating, watching how I responded, looking for tells that would indicate when I was uncomfortable or uncertain. Let's talk about the Hamilton account, she said, shifting gears. You were the primary relationship manager for Hamilton Industries, correct? Yes, and this was a significant account for Meridian Solutions? It was our largest active contract at the time of my termination. Worth approximately $42 million over 3 years? Yes. That's a lot of money, Mr. Morrison. It wasn't a question, so I didn't respond. She waited for a moment, clearly hoping I'd feel compelled to fill the silence. When I didn't, she continued. As relationship manager, you had significant discretion over how that account was serviced, didn't you? I managed the day-to-day operations and the client relationship, but I operated within parameters set by my supervisors and company policy, but within those parameters. You made independent decisions? Yes. You decided which team members worked on which projects. In consultation with my supervisor, yes. You approved timesheets? Yes. You authorized expenses? Within my approval limit, yes. And what was your approval limit? $5,000 per transaction. So anything under $5,000 you could approve without oversight? I could approve it, but it was still subject to audit and review. But in the moment, you had the authority to authorize those expenses? Yes. I could see where she was going. She was building a picture of me as someone with significant autonomy and access, someone who could have theoretically abused that access. It was a narrative framework that would make the accusations against me seem more plausible. Mr. Morrison, were you satisfied with your compensation at Meridian Solutions? Robert stirred slightly next to me. We'd anticipated this line of questioning. I was paid market rate for my position and experience. That's not what I asked. I asked if you were satisfied. I believed I was underpaid relative to my contributions, yes. You felt you deserved more money? I felt my compensation didn't reflect the value I brought to the company. Did you ever discuss this with Mr. Caldwell? Yes, during annual reviews. And what was his response? He indicated that compensation was determined by a formula that took into account various factors, and that while he valued my contributions, there were budgetary constraints. So your requests for higher compensation were denied? They were not approved to the level I requested. Yes, that must have been frustrating. Again, not a question. Again, I didn't respond. Mr. Morrison, did you ever consider that you might deserve a larger share of the revenue from accounts you managed? No, never? I understood that I was an employee, not a partner. The revenue from accounts I managed belonged to the company. But you just said you felt underpaid relative to your contributions. Feeling that my salary should have been higher is different from believing I was entitled to misappropriate company funds. She smiled slightly. I didn't say anything about misappropriation, Mr. Morrison. You were implying it. Was I? Or are you feeling defensive about something? Robert put a hand on my arm, a gentle reminder to stay calm. I took a breath. I'm simply clarifying the distinction between believing one's compensation should be higher and actually stealing from one's employer. Noted, Diane said, making a show of having her associate write something down. Let's talk about your access to company financial systems. You had login credentials that allowed you to view account balances, transaction histories, things of that nature. Yes, for accounts I managed, including the Hamilton account? Yes. And those credentials were unique to you? Yes. So any transactions processed using your credentials would have been processed by you? Theoretically, yes. But credentials can be compromised or spoofed. Do you have any evidence that your credentials were compromised? I have evidence that authentication logs were fabricated to make it appear I had accessed systems. I never accessed. We'll get to that. But in general, as of December 2024, you're not aware of any security breach that would have given someone else access to your credentials? I'm aware of deliberate fabrication of access logs, which is a form of security compromise. But no external breach? No hacking, no stolen passwords? Not that I'm aware of. She spent the next hour walking through specific transactions, specific dates, specific access logs. For each one, she asked whether I recognized it, whether I could explain it, whether I had authorized it. Most of them I had no memory of. They were routine transactions from months ago, the kind of mundane operational activity that happened constantly and left no particular impression. But a few of them were different. A few of them were transactions I knew I hadn't authorized, accesses to systems I knew I hadn't made. Those were the fabricated ones, the ones Derek had created to frame me. I have no recollection of that transaction, I said for the 5th or 6th time. You have no recollection, or you didn't do it? Diane asked. I didn't do it. But the logs show your credentials were used. The logs were fabricated. By whom? Derek Chen, under the direction of Marcus Caldwell. That's quite an accusation, Mr. Morrison. Do you have proof? Yes. Derek Chen has provided a sworn statement detailing exactly how he fabricated those logs, including the technical methodology he used. A statement obtained after you contacted him directly following your termination? Yes. And you don't think it's possible that Mr. Chen, a former subordinate of yours, might have been pressured or coerced into making false statements to support your case? No. Derek came to me because he felt guilty about what he'd been forced to do. He provided his statement voluntarily. Forced by whom? By Marcus Caldwell. So your entire defense rests on the testimony of a subordinate who you claim was coerced by Mr. Caldwell, but who somehow wasn't coerced by you when he decided to support your version of events. It was a good point, rhetorically. The internal logic created a trap. If Derek could be coerced by Marcus, why couldn't he be coerced by me? But it ignored the substance of what Derek had actually provided. Derek's statement includes technical details that can be independently verified, I said. The methodology he describes for fabricating the logs is consistent with what forensic analysis will show. His credibility doesn't rest on his word alone. It rests on whether his technical explanation matches the evidence. Diane made another note. We'll see what the experts say. Let's move on. You mentioned that Jennifer Shu has also provided statements supporting your case. Yes, Miss Shu was the head of human resources at Meridian Solutions. Yes. The same Miss Shu who presided over your termination? Yes. And now she's supporting your lawsuit against the company that employs her? She's provided truthful testimony about what actually happened, or she's covering for her own failures. Isn't it possible, Mr. Morrison, that Miss Shu is cooperating with you because she's afraid of being held responsible for not catching the misconduct you were engaged in? That's not what happened. But it's possible, isn't it, that she's trying to shift blame away from herself by claiming she was coerced by Mr. Caldwell? The emails she provided show a clear pattern of Marcus Caldwell using personal information about employees to control them. That pattern is documented across multiple people, multiple situations. It's not just about me. Emails that she provided after being contacted by you or your attorney. Yes, emails that could have been selectively chosen to present a particular narrative. We've requested complete email records through discovery. If there are emails that contradict the narrative, they'll come to light. The deposition continued for another 3 hours. Diane methodically went through every aspect of my employment, my finances, my relationship with Marcus, my relationship with Derek, my relationship with Jennifer. She asked about my divorce, about my daughter, about my living situation, about my current job search. She was looking for anything that might suggest financial desperation or personal instability or motivation to fabricate my claims. I answered every question carefully, precisely, maintaining the calm that Robert had drilled into me. By the end, I was exhausted, but I'd held my ground. I hadn't contradicted myself, hadn't gotten angry, hadn't given them anything they could use to undermine my credibility. That went well, Robert said as we left the building. You did exactly what you needed to do. She's good, I said. She is. But we're better, and we have the facts on our side. Marcus's deposition was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I wasn't allowed to attend, only the attorneys and the court reporter, but Robert called me immediately afterward to debrief. He was smooth, Robert said. Very prepared, very controlled. He denied everything, obviously, claimed he had no knowledge of any fabricated evidence, that the investigation into your conduct was conducted thoroughly and in good faith, that the decision to terminate you was based solely on the evidence as it was presented to him.
Did he explain the emails Jennifer provided?
He claimed they were taken out of context, that his discussions with Jennifer about building documentation files on employees were standard HR practice, that it's normal to track performance issues in case termination becomes necessary. He characterized his relationship with Jennifer as purely professional and denied having any leverage over her. What about Derek? He was more careful there. He acknowledged that Derek had the technical skills to fabricate evidence, but said there was no reason Derek would do so at his direction. He suggested that Derek might have acted independently, either to sabotage you out of some personal motivation or to protect himself if he was involved in the actual misconduct. That's insane. It's desperate. But it's also the only play he has. If he admits any knowledge of the fabrication, he's done. So he has to deny everything and try to undermine the credibility of our witnesses. Did he seem worried? Robert paused. Yes. He was controlled, but I could see the stress. This is not going the way he planned. The Titan partnership is on hold. The board is asking questions. His reputation is taking damage. He's fighting for his professional life. Good, I thought, but didn't say. Let him feel what it's like to have everything you've built threatened by forces outside your control. Over the next month, the discovery process ground forward. Both sides exchanged thousands of pages of documents, emails, financial records, personnel files. We deposed Jennifer, who provided detailed testimony about Marcus's methods of control and coercion. We deposed Derek, who walked through the technical process of fabricating the authentication logs with a level of detail that was damning in its specificity. Meridian's attorneys deposed my former colleagues, looking for anyone who might testify to poor performance or ethical lapses on my part. They found very little. Most of my former colleagues described me as competent, reliable, and ethical. A few mentioned that I could be reserved or that I seemed frustrated with my career progression, but nothing that suggested I would engage in financial misconduct. The forensic analysis of the authentication logs came back in our favor. The independent expert we'd hired, a former FBI cybercrime investigator named Michael Torres, provided a detailed report explaining exactly how the logs had been manipulated. His findings corroborated Derek's statement in every technical detail. "This is definitive," Robert said when we reviewed Torres's report together. "There's no way to argue that these logs are authentic. The manipulation is obvious once you know what to look for. Derek's methodology left fingerprints that can't be explained away." Will that be enough? It should be. Combined with Jennifer's testimony about Marcus's pattern of behavior and the emails showing premeditation, we have a very strong case. The question now is whether Meridian wants to settle or roll the dice at trial. The answer came 2 weeks later in the form of a settlement offer. Meridian Solutions would pay me $1.2 million, reinstate my employment with full back pay and benefits, issue a public statement acknowledging that the accusations against me were unfounded, and agree to implement new internal controls and oversight procedures. In exchange, I would agree to a confidentiality clause preventing me from discussing the specific details of the settlement and would waive any future claims against the company. Marcus Caldwell would be placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. "It's a good offer," Robert said. "Probably as good as we're going to get without going to trial. The money is substantial, the public acknowledgement clears your reputation, and Marcus faces consequences." "But he doesn't face real consequences," I said. "Administrative leave pending an investigation? That's a slap on the wrist. He'll probably end up with a severance package and a good recommendation. He'll land somewhere else and do the same thing to someone else." "Maybe. But you can't control that. You can only control your own case, your own outcome." I read through the settlement offer again, trying to separate what I wanted from what was realistic. The money would rebuild my savings, would give me security while I figured out my next steps. The public acknowledgement would repair the reputational damage, would make it possible to pursue other opportunities without the cloud of misconduct hanging over me. But the confidentiality clause meant I couldn't talk about what had really happened, couldn't warn others about Marcus, couldn't use my experience to advocate for better protections for employees facing similar situations. And reinstatement? Did I even want to go back to Meridian Solutions? The thought of walking back into that building, of sitting in meetings with people who'd watched me be escorted out in disgrace, of pretending everything was fine now that the company had acknowledged their mistake, it made my stomach turn. "I don't want reinstatement," I said. "I want them to increase the financial settlement in lieu of reinstatement, and I want the confidentiality clause limited to the amount of the settlement and the specific details of the legal proceedings. I should still be able to discuss the general facts of what happened, that I was wrongfully terminated, that evidence was fabricated, that there were systemic issues with how Meridian handled internal complaints." Robert nodded. "I can negotiate that." "What about Marcus? Do you want to push for more severe consequences for him?" I thought about it. What did I actually want? Did I want Marcus fired, his career destroyed, his reputation in tatters? Part of me did. Part of me wanted him to experience the full weight of what he'd done, to lose everything the way I'd almost lost everything. But another part of me, the part that was starting to emerge from beneath the cold rage that had sustained me for the past months, recognized that revenge wasn't the same as justice. That destroying Marcus wouldn't actually fix the systemic problems that had allowed him to operate the way he had. That my anger, however justified, wasn't a sufficient foundation for deciding another person's fate. I want him barred from holding any supervisory or management position at Meridian for at least 5 years, I said finally. And I want the internal investigation to be conducted by an independent third party, not by Meridian's own people. If the investigation finds evidence of misconduct, he should be terminated without severance. If it doesn't find sufficient evidence, he can stay with the company in a non-management role. That's reasonable. I'll present it to their counsel. The negotiations took another 3 weeks. Meridian's attorneys pushed back on nearly every point, but eventually we reached an agreement. The financial settlement increased to $1.8 million. The confidentiality clause was narrowed to exclude general discussion of the circumstances. Marcus would be suspended without pay pending an independent investigation, and if that investigation substantiated the allegations, he would be terminated for cause. I signed the settlement agreement on a Tuesday afternoon in Robert's office. My hand was steady as I wrote my signature, but I felt a strange hollowness. This was what victory looked like, apparently. Money in my bank account, my reputation restored, my antagonist facing consequences. So why didn't it feel like enough? It's normal to feel ambivalent, Robert said, as if reading my thoughts. You've been living with this for months. It's been your entire focus, your reason to get up in the morning. Now it's done, and you have to figure out what comes next, what does come next. That's up to you. You have financial security now. You have time. You can pursue whatever you want. Another job in the industry, a complete career change, early retirement if you're careful with the money. The question is what you actually want. I didn't have an answer. For months, all I'd wanted was to clear my name and hold Marcus accountable. I'd achieved that. But I hadn't thought much beyond it, hadn't considered what my life would look like once the fight was over. The settlement was finalized 2 weeks later. Meridian issued a public statement acknowledging that the accusations against me had been unfounded and that I had been wrongfully terminated. The statement was carefully worded, not quite an apology but an acknowledgement of error. It was enough to repair most of the reputational damage. The independent investigation into Marcus's conduct was assigned to an outside firm that specialized in corporate ethics and compliance. I provided my testimony to them, as did Derek and Jennifer. I never learned all the details of what they found, but 3 months after the investigation began, Meridian Solutions quietly announced that Marcus Caldwell had left the company to pursue other opportunities. Reading that announcement, I felt a complex mix of satisfaction and anticlimax. Marcus was gone. He'd face some professional consequences. The circumstances of his departure would follow him, would make some employers wary. But he wasn't destroyed. He'd probably land somewhere else eventually, probably rebuild his career with a different company that didn't know or didn't care about his history. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. Derek Chen left Meridian a month after Marcus. He sent me an email before he left, brief and awkward, thanking me for not seeking personal retaliation against him and expressing hope that he could rebuild his own career with the lessons he'd learned. I wrote back wishing him well. I didn't forgive him exactly, but I understood him. He'd been caught in an impossible situation, and he'd eventually made the right choice, even though it had cost him. Jennifer Shue stayed at Meridian. We never spoke again after the settlement was finalized, but I heard through mutual contacts that she'd used the experience to push for changes in how the company handled internal complaints and employee protections. Maybe she'd found her own form of redemption in that work. I hoped so. As for me, I spent the first few weeks after the settlement in a strange state of suspended animation. I had no job, no routine, no immediate obligations. I woke up each morning with a vast expanse of empty time ahead of me and no clear idea how to fill it. Rachel visited for a long weekend in March. She'd finished her semester and had a break before summer classes began. We spent the time talking, really talking, in a way we hadn't in years. I told her everything about the case, about the fight, about the person I'd become during those months. "I'm proud of you," she said one evening as we sat on my apartment balcony watching the sunset. "You could have just taken the easy way out, could have signed their agreement and moved on. But you fought for yourself. I'm not sure the person who fought was someone to be proud of," I said. I was cold, manipulative. "I used people. You did what you had to do to survive," she said. "That's not the same as being cruel or evil. You were fighting against people who were actually cruel, actually willing to destroy others for their own benefit. The fact that you had to be strategic and calculating doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. I don't know if I like who I became, maybe not, but maybe that person was always part of you, and the situation just forced you to acknowledge it. We all have the capacity to be hard when we need to be. The question is whether we use that hardness for good reasons or bad ones. You used it to stand up for yourself and to hold someone accountable. That's not something to be ashamed of." I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that the coldness I'd discovered in myself was just a tool, something I could put away now that the crisis had passed. But I wasn't sure it worked that way. I wasn't sure I could go back to being the person I'd been before, the one who'd accepted injustice as an inevitable feature of professional life. "What are you going to do now?" Rachel asked. "I don't know. I've been thinking about that a lot. You could consult independently, start your own firm, work with clients on your own terms. Maybe. I don't know if I want to stay in the industry. Every time I think about going back to that world, I just feel tired." "Then don't. You have enough money to take time, to figure out what you actually want rather than what you think you should want." She was right. The settlement had given me freedom. Not unlimited freedom, but enough to be deliberate about what came next rather than desperate. Over the following months, I started to rebuild. Not my career, at least not immediately, but my sense of self. I started running again, longer distances than before, pushing my body until the physical exhaustion drowned out the mental noise. I started reading books I'd always meant to read but never had time for. I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected during my years of single-minded career focus. And slowly, I started to feel like a person again, rather than just a collection of grievances and strategies. In June, almost exactly 6 months after my termination, I received a call from a former colleague named Alan Martinez. Alan had left Meridian 3 years earlier to start his own consulting practice focused on organizational ethics and whistleblower protections. I'd worked with him briefly and had always respected his integrity. "I heard about what happened," Alan said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, but I'm glad you fought. Thank you. I'm calling because I'm putting together a workshop series for mid-career professionals about navigating corporate politics and protecting yourself from exactly the kind of situation you experienced. I was wondering if you'd be willing to participate as a speaker. Share your story, talk about the warning signs you missed, the things you'd do differently." I was quiet for a moment, considering. The settlement's confidentiality clause prevented me from discussing specific financial details or the exact mechanics of the legal proceedings, but it didn't prevent me from talking about the general experience, the lessons learned, the systemic issues that had enabled Marcus's behavior. "I'd be interested," I said, "but I need to think about what I'm comfortable sharing. Of course, take your time. But Tom, a lot of people go through what you went through and never fight back. The fact that you did, that you held them accountable, that's valuable. That's a story people need to hear." After we hung up, I sat with the idea. For months, I'd been focused entirely on my own case, my own vindication. But what if I could use that experience to help others? What if the hardness I'd developed, the willingness to fight, could be channeled into something constructive? I called Robert Park and ran the idea by him, making sure it wouldn't violate the settlement agreement. He confirmed that speaking generally about wrongful termination and corporate accountability would be permissible as long as I didn't disclose the settlement amount or specific details of Meridian's internal processes. 2 months later, I gave my first talk at one of Alan's workshops. 23 people attended, all of them mid-career professionals who'd experienced or witnessed workplace injustice and wanted to understand their options and rights. I told them my story, not in detail, but in broad strokes, the warning signs I'd missed, the importance of documenting everything, the value of finding allies and witnesses, the necessity of being strategic rather than emotional when fighting back, the toll it takes, psychologically and financially, the ambivalence of victory when you realize that even winning doesn't quite restore what was taken from you. "The system is not designed to protect you," I told them. "It's designed to protect itself. If you find yourself in a situation where you need to fight, you need to understand that you're going up against an institution that has more resources, more power, and more experience at these battles than you do. That doesn't mean you can't win, but it means you need to be smart, you need to be patient, and you need to be willing to become someone harder than you might be comfortable being." After the talk, several people came up to thank me, to share their own stories, to ask for advice. One woman told me she'd been documenting problems at her company for months but had been too scared to come forward. One man told me he'd accepted a wrongful termination settlement years ago and had regretted not fighting ever since. Driving home that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose, not the obsessive, consuming focus of the lawsuit, but something quieter and more sustainable. A sense that my experience, as painful as it had been, could mean something beyond just my own vindication. I started speaking regularly. Alan's workshops, professional conferences, university career centers. I developed a reputation as someone who'd fought and won, someone who could offer practical advice grounded in real experience. Some organizations paid me for these talks, which was nice but not necessary given the settlement. Others I did for free, particularly when speaking to students or early career professionals who couldn't afford expensive professional development. I also started consulting with employment attorneys, helping them prepare clients for the kind of fight I'd been through. I could spot the warning signs, could help document evidence, could provide the perspective of someone who'd been through the process and understood what worked and what didn't. It wasn't the career I'd envisioned when I'd started at Meridian Solutions 11 years earlier, but it was meaningful work, and it used the hardness I'd developed, the strategic thinking, the willingness to confront powerful people and institutions in service of something larger than my own grievances. Rachel noticed the change when she visited for Thanksgiving. "You seem different," she said. "Lighter. Somehow, I feel different," I admitted. More like myself than I have in years. The version of yourself that existed before Meridian? Or someone new? Both, maybe. I think I'm finally integrating the different parts. The person who wants to be kind and the person who knows when to be hard. The person who believes in justice and the person who understands that justice requires fighting for... She smiled. I like this version of you. So do I. That December, exactly 1 year after my termination, I received a message through my website from a woman named Sarah Chen. No relation to Derek, just a common surname. She was a 42-year-old project manager at a tech company who'd been accused of leaking confidential information to a competitor. She'd been fired, escorted from the building, and was now facing not just professional ruin, but potential criminal charges. She believed she was being framed by her supervisor, a man who'd felt threatened by her competence and her popularity with the team. She had some evidence, inconsistencies in the timeline, witnesses who could testify to her supervisor's hostility toward her, digital footprints that didn't quite match the accusation. But she was overwhelmed, scared, and didn't know how to fight an institution with vastly more resources than she had. I read her message 3 times. Then I called her. Tell me everything, I said, and I heard the echo of my conversation with Derek in that coffee shop a year earlier. But this time I was on the other side of it, not the victim seeking help, but someone who could provide it. We talked for an hour. I took notes, asked questions, helped her think through her options. I connected her with Robert Park, who agreed to take her case. I walked her through what the process would look like, what she should prepare for, how to maintain her sanity during the months of uncertainty ahead. Thank you, she said at the end of our call, her voice breaking slightly. I felt so alone with this, like I was going crazy, like nobody would believe me. I believe you, I said, and you're not alone. You're going to get through this. It's going to be hard, but you're going to survive it. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet of my apartment and thought about the journey I'd been on. From that conference room where I'd been stripped of my career and reputation, through the months of cold rage and strategic calculation, through the legal battles and depositions and settlements, to this moment where I could use what I'd learned to help someone else navigate the same dark passage. It wasn't the redemption I'd imagined when I'd first started fighting. It wasn't dramatic or cinematic. But it was real, it was meaningful, and it was enough. 2 years after my termination from Meridian Solutions, I stood in a hotel conference room in downtown Chicago, watching 300 people file in for a keynote presentation I'd been invited to deliver. The conference was focused on corporate ethics and employee rights, and somehow I'd become enough of a presence in that space to warrant the invitation. The moderator introduced me with a biography that felt like it belonged to someone else. Tom Morrison is a leading advocate for wrongful termination victims and a consultant to major employment law firms across the country. After successfully challenging his own wrongful termination and exposing corporate misconduct at his former employer, he has dedicated himself to helping others navigate similar situations. I walked to the podium with the same measured calm I'd cultivated during my deposition 2 years earlier. But this time, the calm came from a different place. Not from suppressing emotion, but from genuine equilibrium. I'd spent 2 years processing what had happened to me, integrating it into my identity rather than letting it define me entirely. I want to start by acknowledging something uncomfortable, I said, looking out at the audience. When we talk about wrongful termination, about corporate misconduct, about standing up for yourself against powerful institutions, we tend to tell heroic narratives. The brave individual against the corrupt system, the David versus Goliath story where righteousness triumphs. I paused, letting that sit. But the reality is messier. The reality is that fighting back transforms you in ways you don't fully control. You have to become harder, more calculating, more willing to use people and manipulate situations than you might be comfortable with. You have to sacrifice parts of yourself. Your idealism, your faith in institutional fairness, maybe even your basic trust in other people. And even when you win, even when you get justice, you don't get those parts of yourself back unchanged. The room was quiet. I could see people leaning forward, engaged. My name is Tom Morrison. 2 years ago, I was fired from a job I'd held for 11 years. I was accused of financial misconduct I didn't commit, based on evidence that was deliberately fabricated by my supervisor and colleagues. I was escorted from the building. My reputation was destroyed, and I was threatened with criminal prosecution if I fought back. I told them the story. Not all the details, some things remained protected by the settlement agreement, and some things were simply too personal to share with an audience of strangers. But I told them enough. The betrayal, the initial shock and helplessness, the decision to fight, the slow, methodical process of building a case, the moral compromises and strategic calculations, the depositions and negotiations and eventual settlement. The thing nobody tells you about winning, I said, is that it doesn't feel the way you expect it to feel. You imagine vindication will be sweet, that holding people accountable will be satisfying, and there is satisfaction in it. But there's also emptiness, because you can't unring the bell. You can't go back to the person you were before you learned that people you trusted were willing to destroy you for their own convenience. I saw heads nodding throughout the audience. These were people who understood, who'd been through their own versions of what I'd experienced. So if you're facing a situation like I faced, if you're trying to decide whether to fight or to accept injustice and move on, I want to be honest with you about what fighting means. It means months or years of your life consumed by the battle. It means significant financial cost, even if you eventually win. It means relationships strained or broken by the stress. It means becoming someone harder than you are right now. I took a breath. But it also means refusing to be erased. It means standing up and saying that what happened to you was wrong, that it mattered, that you matter. It means holding powerful people accountable for their actions. It means maybe, if you're lucky, using your experience to help others who come after you. So my advice is this: be strategic. Document everything from the moment you sense something is wrong. Build alliances before you need them. Understand that the institution will protect itself above all else, and that you're going to be fighting an entity with more resources and more experience at these battles than you have. Find a good attorney, not just a competent one, but someone who genuinely believes in your case, and be prepared for it to change you. Be prepared to discover capacities in yourself you didn't know existed, for calculation, for ruthlessness, for patience in pursuit of vindication. I paused again, considering what else needed to be said. But also remember your humanity. Remember that revenge and justice aren't the same thing. Remember that the people who wronged you are still people, flawed and afraid and operating from their own damage. You don't have to forgive them, but you also don't have to let hatred consume you. You can hold people accountable while still recognizing their humanity. You can fight without losing yourself entirely. The presentation continued for another 40 minutes. I walked through practical strategies, legal protections, psychological tactics for maintaining equilibrium during a long fight. I took questions from the audience, specific detailed questions about documentation and evidence, and how to approach potentially hostile witnesses. Afterward, people lined up to talk to me. A young woman who'd been sexually harassed by her supervisor and was terrified of reporting it. An older man who'd been forced into early retirement through a campaign of age discrimination. A middle-aged woman whose company had stolen her intellectual property and then terminated her when she complained. Story after story, each one a variation on the same fundamental theme: power without accountability, institutions protecting themselves, individuals left to navigate the aftermath of betrayal. I listened to all of them, offered what advice I could, connected some of them with attorneys I trusted, provided others with resources and reading materials. It was exhausting but also energizing. This was meaningful work, using my experience to help others avoid my mistakes or at least understand what they were facing. That evening, I had dinner with Alan Martinez and 2 other speakers from the conference. We talked about the state of employment law, about patterns we were seeing in corporate misconduct, about systemic changes that might actually protect employees rather than just creating the appearance of protection. "You've built something real," Alan said at one point. 2 years ago, you were just trying to survive. Now you're one of the leading voices in this space. That's remarkable. "I'm not sure I set out to build anything," I admitted. "I was just trying to make sense of what happened to me. The advocacy work came later, almost by accident." "The best work usually does," Alan said. "The people who are most effective are the ones who aren't doing it for career advancement or recognition. They're doing it because they can't not do it, because they've seen something that needs changing and they have the skills or experience to change it." Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I thought about what he'd said. Had I chosen this path, or had it chosen me? I'd been forced into a fight I never wanted, had been transformed by that fight in ways I never anticipated, and had eventually found meaning in using that transformation to help others. Was that agency or just making the best of circumstances beyond my control? Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe the important thing was simply that I'd found purpose in the aftermath of trauma, had discovered a way to turn pain into something constructive. The next morning, I flew back home. My apartment was still the same one-bedroom place I'd moved into after my divorce, but I'd finally started making it feel like a home rather than just a place to sleep between work obligations. Books on the shelves, art on the walls, plants that I actually remembered to water. Small changes, but they reflected a larger shift in how I related to my own life. Rachel was coming to visit for the weekend. She'd graduated from college the previous spring and had taken a job with an environmental nonprofit in Seattle. She was busy and fulfilled and building her own life, but we still talked regularly and saw each other every few months. "I'm proud of the work you're doing," she told me over dinner that Saturday. We'd cook together in my small kitchen, a routine we'd developed during her visits. Not just because it's helping people, but because you found a way to transform something terrible into something meaningful. "I'm still figuring out if I actually transformed it or if I'm just managing it," I said. "Does that distinction matter? I don't know. Sometimes I worry that I'm defined by what happened to me, that I've built an identity around being a victim who fought back, and that if I ever let go of that identity, I won't know who I am." Rachel was quiet for a moment, considering. She'd always been thoughtful, willing to sit with difficult questions rather than rushing to reassure. "I think that's a real risk. But I also think you're aware of it, which means you can make different choices. You don't have to let this be the only thing that defines you." "What else defines me?" "You're my dad. You're someone who runs 6 miles every morning. You're someone who reads philosophy and history. You're someone who makes terrible jokes and who cries at sentimental movies, even though you try to hide it. You're lots of things, Dad. The fight with Meridian is just one chapter." She was right, of course, but it was a chapter that had changed the narrative of my entire life, that had forced me to confront who I actually was beneath the professional identity I'd constructed over decades of corporate work. "Do you think I'm a good person?" I asked suddenly. Rachel looked surprised by the question. "Yes. Unequivocally yes. Why would you doubt that?" "Because of the things I did during the fight, the way I manipulated Derek, used Jennifer's guilt, calculated every interaction for maximum strategic advantage. Good people don't do those things." "Good people do what they need to do to survive," Rachel said firmly. "You weren't manipulating people for fun or for profit. You were fighting against someone who was actively trying to destroy you. The fact that you feel guilty about the tactics you used is actually proof that you are a good person. Bad people don't agonize over moral compromises." I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that the hardness I discovered in myself was a tool rather than a character flaw, something I could access when necessary, but that didn't define my fundamental nature. Over the following months, I continued to build my practice. I was consulting with about a dozen employment law firms, helping them prepare clients for wrongful termination cases. I was speaking regularly at conferences and workshops. I'd even started writing a book about my experience and the broader systemic issues that enable corporate misconduct. The book was difficult to write. Not technically, I'd always been comfortable with written communication, but emotionally. Every chapter required me to revisit moments I'd rather forget, to analyze my own decisions with the benefit of hindsight, to be honest about my mistakes and miscalculations alongside my victories. I titled it Fighting Invisible: How to Challenge Wrongful Termination When the System is Designed to Silence You. It wasn't a catchy title, but it was accurate. My publisher wanted me to make it more dramatic, more sensational. Play up the David versus Goliath angle, my editor suggested. Make Marcus Caldwell into more of a villain. Give readers someone to root against. But I resisted that impulse. Marcus was a villain in my story, but he was also a human being, someone operating from his own fears and ambitions and damage. Making him into a cartoonish antagonist would have been satisfying but dishonest. It would have obscured the more important point, that the system creates and rewards people like Marcus, that individual bad actors are symptoms of larger structural problems. The book was published 18 months after my keynote in Chicago. It got modest but respectful reviews. Some critics praised its practical focus and refusal to indulge in melodrama. Others found it too dry, too focused on process and not enough on emotional catharsis. I didn't particularly care either way. I'd written the book I needed to write, the one that told the truth as I understood it, rather than the one that would sell the most copies. What surprised me was the response from readers. I started getting emails, dozens of them, then hundreds, people who'd read the book and recognized themselves in my story. people who were currently fighting their own battles and found something useful in my analysis, people who'd accepted wrongful terminations years ago and were still carrying the weight of that injustice. One email from a woman named Patricia Vance stayed with me. She was 56 years old, had been fired from a financial services firm 3 years earlier under circumstances eerily similar to mine. She'd signed the separation agreement, taken the meager settlement, and spent the last 3 years trying to rebuild her career while carrying the burden of knowing she'd been framed and had done nothing about it. "I keep thinking about what you wrote about the cost of silence," she wrote. "About how accepting injustice doesn't actually protect you. It just transfers the cost from the short term to the long term. I thought I was being smart by taking the settlement and moving on. But I've spent 3 years with this weight on my chest, this knowledge that I let them get away with it. I can't sleep. I can't look at myself in the mirror without feeling ashamed. And reading your book, I finally understand that I made the wrong choice. Not because I was a coward, but because I didn't understand that fighting back was even possible." She asked if it was too late to challenge what had happened to her. I had to tell her that yes, legally speaking, she'd likely waived her rights when she signed the separation agreement 3 years ago. But I also told her that it wasn't too late to reclaim her sense of self, to stop carrying the shame that belonged to the people who'd wronged her. I didn't know if she found that helpful. But her email reminded me why the work mattered, why it was important to be honest about both the possibilities and the limitations of fighting back. 3 years after my termination, I was invited to speak at a Senate subcommittee hearing on corporate accountability and employee protections. It was surreal, sitting at a table in a wood-paneled hearing room, speaking into a microphone while senators asked me questions about my experience and my recommendations for policy reform. I testified about the structural imbalances that make wrongful termination cases so difficult to pursue, about the inadequacy of current whistleblower protections, about the ways confidentiality clauses in settlement agreements prevent patterns of misconduct from being exposed, about the need for independent oversight of corporate HR departments. Most of the senators seemed genuinely interested, asked thoughtful questions, took notes. A few were clearly just performing for the cameras, asking leading questions designed to score political points rather than to elicit useful information. That was fine. I'd learned to work within systems as they existed rather than as I wished they were. Nothing came of the hearing in terms of immediate policy changes, but it was covered by major news outlets, which meant more people became aware of the issues. Several law schools reached out to invite me to speak to their students. A few corporations contacted me to consult on improving their internal complaint procedures. Small ripples, but ripples nonetheless. That summer, I got an unexpected phone call from Derek Chen. We hadn't spoken since shortly after the settlement was finalized 3 years earlier. I wasn't sure what to expect when I answered. "Tom," he said, his voice uncertain. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from your website. It's fine. How are you?" "I'm good. Better than I was. I wanted to let you know that I've been sober for 18 months now." I hadn't known Derek had a drinking problem, but thinking back, there had been signs during those months when he'd been fabricating evidence at Marcus's direction. The stress, the guilt, the sleeplessness. Of course, he'd turned to something to manage those feelings. "That's significant," I said. "Congratulations. Part of my recovery process is making amends to people I've harmed. And Tom, I harmed you. I know I apologized before. I know I provided testimony that helped your case, but I never really acknowledged the full weight of what I did. I destroyed your career. I destroyed your reputation. I was so focused on protecting myself that I didn't think about what I was doing to you as a human being." He paused, and I could hear him taking a shaky breath. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not asking for that. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did, and I'm trying to be someone who would never do that again. I'm trying to be better." I sat with that for a moment. Did I forgive Derek? I'd spent 3 years telling myself that he'd been a victim too, that Marcus had coerced him, that his cooperation with my case had balanced the scales. But hearing his voice now, hearing him acknowledge the full scope of his actions, I realized I'd been intellectualizing something that was fundamentally emotional. Derek had hurt me, intentionally, knowingly, for his own benefit. The fact that he'd been scared and pressured didn't erase that. The fact that he'd eventually done the right thing didn't undo the initial wrong. But I'd also learned, over the past 3 years, that holding on to resentment was its own form of prison, that justice and healing weren't always the same thing. That sometimes you had to let go of anger, not because the other person deserved forgiveness, but because you deserved peace. I appreciate you calling, I said finally. I appreciate you doing the work to understand what happened and to change. That takes courage. Does that mean you forgive me? I don't know if I forgive you, I said honestly. But I don't hate you, and I hope you build a good life. I hope you use what you learned from this experience to be the kind of person who stands up for others instead of participating in their destruction. I'm trying. I've actually been doing some volunteer work with a legal aid organization, helping low-income people who are facing workplace discrimination, trying to use my technical skills for something good. That surprised me. That's meaningful work. It is. And Tom, thank you. Not just for not destroying me when you could have, but for showing me that it was possible to fight. I spent so much of my life believing that you just had to accept whatever powerful people did to you. Watching you refuse to accept that changed something in me. After we hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about redemption and second chances and the strange paths that trauma carves through people's lives. Derek had been an antagonist in my story, someone who'd facilitated my destruction. But he was also someone who'd been damaged by the same system that had damaged me, who'd made terrible choices under pressure and was now trying to become someone better. I hoped he succeeded. Not for his sake, necessarily, but because the world needed more people who learned from their mistakes instead of rationalizing them. That fall, I was contacted by Marcus Caldwell's attorney. Marcus wanted to meet with me. No recording devices, no witnesses, just the two of us in a neutral location. The attorney assured me it wasn't a threat or an attempt to intimidate. Marcus simply wanted to talk. I discussed it with Robert Park, who advised against it. You have nothing to gain from this meeting and potentially a lot to lose. He could be trying to manipulate you, to gather information, to find some way to undermine the settlement. But I was curious. 3 years had passed. Marcus had lost his position at Meridian, had faced professional consequences, had presumably had time to reflect on what had happened. What could he possibly want to say to me now? I agreed to the meeting on the condition that it take place in a public location of my choosing and that I could leave at any time. We met at a coffee shop in a neighborhood equidistant between where we both lived now. Neutral territory. Marcus looked older. The silver hair had more gray. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He'd lost weight, looked less polished, less like the confident executive who'd sat at the head of that conference room table 3 years ago. Thank you for agreeing to this, he said as we sat down at a corner table. I didn't respond, just waited. I'm sure you're wondering why I wanted to meet, he continued. The truth is, I don't entirely know myself. Partially it's because my therapist suggested it might be helpful. Partially because I've been carrying this weight for 3 years and I needed to say some things to you directly. I'm listening. He looked down at his coffee cup, seemed to be gathering his thoughts. I want you to know that I understand what I did was wrong. Not just strategically wrong or legally wrong, but morally wrong. I destroyed your career to protect mine. I used people who trusted me. I fabricated evidence and then convinced myself that it was justified, that it was just business, that you'd understand if our positions were reversed. He looked up at me, and I was startled to see something that looked like genuine anguish in his eyes. But it wasn't just business, it was a betrayal. And it wasn't justified by anything except my own fear and ambition. I knew you were innocent. I knew the evidence was fabricated, and I did it anyway because it was convenient for me. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to hear it. Because you deserve an actual apology, not the corporate non-apology that Meridian issued. What I did to you was unforgivable, and I know that. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just acknowledging the truth of what happened. I studied him, trying to read whether this was genuine or another manipulation. But he seemed smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of what he'd done. This wasn't the confident predator I'd been fighting against. This was someone who'd lost something fundamental, maybe his self-image, maybe his ability to pretend he was a good person doing necessary things. What happened to you? I asked. After you left Meridian? I've had trouble finding work, he admitted. My reputation in the industry is damaged. People know what happened, or they've heard rumors. I've had a few consulting contracts, nothing permanent. My marriage fell apart. My wife left me about a year ago. She said she didn't recognize the person I'd become, or maybe that she finally recognized the person I'd always been. He took a breath. I've been in therapy twice a week for the past 2 years, trying to understand how I became someone who could do what I did, trying to figure out if it's possible to change at my age, or if I'm just permanently broken. And what have you learned? that I've spent my entire career optimizing for short-term advantage without considering long-term consequences. That I learned early on that the appearance of integrity was more valuable than actual integrity. That I became very good at justifying things to myself, at creating narratives where I was always the hero or at least the pragmatic realist making tough calls. He looked at me directly. I learned that I destroyed you because I could, because it was easier than confronting my own failures, because scapegoating you was the path of least resistance. And I've learned that living with that knowledge is harder than I ever imagined it would be. I sat with that. Part of me wanted to tell him that he deserved to suffer, that his guilt was appropriate and insufficient. Part of me wanted to ask him why he thought I cared about his therapeutic revelations, why his internal struggle mattered compared to the external damage he'd caused. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 years thinking about justice and revenge and the difference between them, recognized that this moment mattered. Not because Marcus's suffering made up for mine, but because his acknowledgement of what he'd done was its own kind of accountability. "I'm not going to tell you that I forgive you," I said finally. "I'm not there yet, and I might never be there. What you did caused enormous damage to my career, to my reputation, to my sense of trust in professional relationships. I spent months fighting to clear my name, and even though I won, I lost things I can't get back. I know, but I also want you to know that I don't hate you. I did, for a while, but hate is exhausting, and it doesn't serve me, so I've let it go. Not for your benefit, but for mine." Marcus nodded slowly. "That's more than I deserve? Probably. But this isn't about what you deserve. This is about what I need to move forward." We sat in silence for a moment. Then Marcus said quietly, "For what it's worth, watching you fight changed something in me. You were supposed to accept what happened, take the settlement, disappear. That's what everyone else I'd done this to had done. But you didn't. You fought back, you exposed what I'd done, you held me accountable. And in some strange way, that was a gift. How was it a gift? Because it forced me to face what I'd become. If you just disappeared, I could have kept telling myself that what I'd done was normal, that everyone operates that way, that it was just business. But you didn't let me have that comfort. You made me see myself clearly, and even though that's been painful, it's also been necessary." I thought about that. About the ways that fighting back had changed me, had forced me to discover capacities I didn't know I had, about how Marcus's actions had inadvertently set me on a path toward more meaningful work, toward advocacy and purpose. Neither of us had emerged from this unchanged, but the transformations had taken us in different directions. "I hope you find a way to be better," I said. "I hope you use this experience to become someone who doesn't hurt people for convenience. But that's your work to do, not mine." I understand. We talked for a few more minutes, awkward small talk about nothing important. Then Marcus thanked me for meeting with him and left. I sat there for a while afterward, processing the encounter, trying to understand what I felt. Not closure, exactly. The damage was still real, the losses were still losses. But something had shifted. Some portion of the weight I'd been carrying had been transferred back to where it belonged, with the person who'd actually caused the harm. I called Rachel that evening and told her about the meeting. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Lighter," I said, which surprises me. I thought seeing him would bring back all the anger, all the resentment, but mostly I just felt sad. Sad for who he could have been if he'd made different choices. Sad for all the damage he caused that can't be undone. But not angry anymore. "That sounds like healing," Rachel said. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just exhaustion. Maybe I've been carrying this for so long that I'm finally ready to put it down. Either way, I'm glad." 4 years after my termination, I gave a keynote at a major legal conference in San Francisco. The audience was larger than any I'd spoken to before, over 800 attorneys, HR professionals, and corporate compliance officers. The topic was institutional accountability in the modern workplace. I'd refined my message over dozens of presentations, had learned what resonated and what fell flat. But I still felt nervous before major talks, still worried that I'd say something wrong or fail to convey the complexity of what I'd learned. The speech went well. I talked about my experience, but also about broader patterns, about the systems that enable misconduct, about the structural changes needed to actually protect employees rather than just creating the appearance of protection. I talked about the role of HR departments, which too often function as protectors of the institution rather than as advocates for employees. I talked about the inadequacy of current whistleblower protections and the ways that confidentiality clauses in settlement agreements prevent patterns of abuse from being exposed. And I talked about the personal cost of fighting, about the transformation it requires, about the need to be honest with people about what they're choosing when they decide to challenge wrongful termination. Justice is possible, I concluded, but it's not easy, it's not quick, and it's not guaranteed. The decision to fight is intensely personal, and there's no wrong answer. Some people choose to fight and win vindication. Some people choose to fight and lose, but refuse to be silenced. Some people choose not to fight because the cost is too high, and that's valid too. What matters is that the choice is truly yours, made with full understanding of the stakes and the odds. The applause was sustained and genuine. During the Q&A session that followed, people asked thoughtful questions about specific tactics, about how to evaluate whether a case was winnable, about how to maintain psychological resilience during a long legal battle. One woman asked a question that cut to the heart of everything. Do you think the system can actually be fixed, or are we just treating symptoms of a fundamentally broken structure? I thought about it carefully before answering. I think we're in the symptoms phase right now. The fundamental structure, the power imbalance between institutions and individuals, the profit motive that rewards short-term thinking over ethical behavior, the way that accountability always seems to flow downward rather than upward. Those things aren't changing quickly. But treating symptoms still matters. Every individual case we win, every person we help protect themselves, every bad actor we hold accountable, those are real victories, even if they don't solve the systemic problem. So we should give up on systemic change? No. We should pursue both. We should help individuals fight their specific battles while also advocating for the structural changes that would make those battles unnecessary. It's not either or, it's both and. After the conference, I had dinner with Robert Park and several other employment attorneys I'd worked with over the years. We talked shop, shared war stories, commiserated about difficult judges and obstructive opposing counsel. But we also talked about the wins, about clients we'd helped, about the slow accumulation of precedents that were making these cases slightly easier to pursue. You've made a real impact, Robert told me toward the end of the evening, not just with your own case, but with all the work you've done since. You've helped hundreds of people, maybe thousands if you count everyone who's read your book or attended your presentations. That's meaningful legacy. It still feels incomplete, I admitted, like I'm applying bandages when what we really need is surgery, maybe. But a lot of people are alive today because someone applied a bandage when they needed it. Don't discount that. Flying home the next day, I thought about legacy and meaning and the strange path my life had taken. 4 years ago, I'd been a mid-level consultant chasing recognition and advancement in a career that was slowly crushing my soul. Now I was someone who'd fought and won, who'd transformed trauma into advocacy, who'd found purpose in helping others navigate the darkness I'd passed through. Was it better? Was this version of my life superior to the one I'd been living before my termination? I wasn't sure how to answer that I'd lost things. My faith in institutional fairness, my ability to trust easily, a certain innocence about how power operates in professional settings. But I'd gained things too, self-knowledge, resilience, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal advancement. Maybe it wasn't about better or worse. Maybe it was just about different, about the person I'd become in response to circumstances I never chose. Rachel got married that fall. She'd been dating someone she'd met through her environmental work, a marine biologist named David who was kind and thoughtful and obviously devoted to her. The wedding was small, just family and close friends, held at a botanical garden in Seattle. Walking her down the aisle, I felt the weight of time passing, of my daughter becoming fully her own person, building her own life independent of me. But I also felt grateful that despite everything, the divorce, my career turmoil, the stress and uncertainty of the past few years, Rachel had grown into someone whole and happy. At the reception, she pulled me aside. "Dad, I want you to know something. I know the past few years have been hard for you. I know you've questioned who you've become, whether the fight was worth it, whether you lost too much of yourself in the process. Rachel, just listen. You're the most ethical person I know, not because you've never made mistakes or compromises, but because you've never stopped questioning yourself, never stopped trying to do better. What happened with Meridian didn't break you. It refined you. It showed you capabilities you didn't know you had, and you've used those capabilities to help people. I'm proud to be your daughter. I felt tears welling up, unexpected and unwelcome. I'm proud to be your father. She hugged me tightly. I love you, Dad, and I'm glad you fought. Not just because you won, but because you showed me that fighting is possible, that you don't have to accept injustice, that you can stand up for yourself even when it's hard. Later that night, alone in my hotel room, I thought about what she'd said, about whether the fight had been worth it, about who I'd become, and whether I could accept that person. The answer was complex. I'd paid prices I hadn't anticipated. I'd discovered a capacity for coldness and calculation that still sometimes frightened me. I'd learned that justice and healing weren't the same thing, that winning didn't erase the damage, that transformation was permanent even when you weren't sure you wanted to be transformed. But I'd also found meaning. I'd helped people who were facing what I'd faced. I'd used my experience to make the world slightly less cruel, slightly more accountable, slightly more just. I'd become someone who stood up rather than someone who accepted. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. 5 years after my termination from Meridian Solutions, I received an invitation to speak at their annual ethics and compliance training. The irony was not lost on me. The invitation came from their new CEO, a woman named Catherine Park, who'd been brought in 2 years earlier to overhaul the company culture after Marcus's departure and the revelations that had followed. She'd read my book and wanted me to address the entire company about what had happened, about the systemic failures that had enabled it, about how to create accountability mechanisms that actually worked. I almost declined. The thought of returning to that building, of facing people who'd watched my humiliation, who'd believed the lies about me, who'd participated in or at least enabled my destruction, it felt like too much. But then I thought about the people who were there now, who hadn't been part of what happened to me, who were trying to build something better. And I thought about the responsibility I had to use my platform for something more than just my own vindication. I accepted the invitation. The training session was held in a large conference room on the 3rd floor. Not the same room where I'd been terminated, but close enough to bring back the memories. 200 employees attended, a mix of people I'd worked with and people who'd joined after I'd left. Catherine Park introduced me with a directness I appreciated. 5 years ago, this company did something inexcusable. We wrongfully terminated an employee based on fabricated evidence. We allowed a toxic culture where power was used to destroy people who were perceived as threats or obstacles. And we failed in every possible way to live up to our stated values of integrity and accountability. She paused, letting that sink in. Tom Morrison sued us. He won. And in the process of winning, he exposed problems that went far beyond his individual case. Many of you know this story. But today, Tom is going to tell you what it was like to live through it. Not as a legal case study, but as a human being who was betrayed by people he trusted. I walked to the front of the room. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. But standing there, looking out at faces that ranged from familiar to unknown, I felt the full weight of the past 5 years. I'm going to tell you a story, I began. But before I do, I want you to understand something. This isn't a story about me being a hero. I'm not here to receive your sympathy or your admiration. I'm here because what happened to me could happen to anyone in this room. And I want you to understand how it happens, why it happens, and what you can do to prevent it. I told them everything. The warning signs I'd missed, the fabricated evidence, the termination meeting, the decision to fight, the depositions and discoveries, the witnesses who came forward, the settlement, the aftermath. But I also told them about the system that had enabled it, about the HR department that had functioned as a tool of management rather than as an advocate for employees, about the lack of independent oversight, about the culture that rewarded performance and advancement over ethics and integrity, about the way that power concentrated at the top and accountability disappeared. Marcus Caldwell was not an anomaly, I said. He was a product of a system that created and rewarded people like him. He was someone who learned that appearing ethical was more valuable than being ethical. He was someone who understood that in most organizations, the real rule is don't get caught, not don't do wrong. I could see people shifting uncomfortably. Good, they should be uncomfortable. Some of you worked with me. Some of you were in the office the day I was escorted out. Some of you heard the accusations and believed them, or at least didn't question them. I don't blame you for that. When an institution speaks with authority, when your managers tell you someone has committed misconduct, it's natural to believe them. But I want you to think about what it means to believe without questioning, about what it means to accept institutional narratives without demanding evidence, about your own responsibility as employees and as human beings to think critically and to stand up when something doesn't seem right. I paused, looking around the room. If this happened again, if someone you work with is suddenly accused of misconduct and terminated, what would you do? Would you accept the official story? Would you ask questions? Would you support that person if they decided to fight? Or would you protect yourself by staying silent and hoping you're never the one who needs support? The room was silent, painfully, uncomfortably silent. I'm not asking you to be heroes, I continued. I'm asking you to be conscious, to pay attention to patterns, to document things that don't seem right, to build relationships with colleagues so that if something happens, you have people you can trust, to understand your rights and protections so that you can make informed decisions if you're ever in a position like I was. I talked for another 40 minutes about specific practical steps they could take, about documentation best practices, about how to evaluate whether to report misconduct versus when to protect yourself, about resources available to employees facing retaliation, about the importance of building networks of support. At the end, I opened it up for questions. Hands went up immediately. A young man in his 20s asked, "Do you regret fighting? Would it have been easier to just take the settlement and move on?" Easier. Yes, almost certainly. Better? I don't think so. Fighting was the hardest thing I've ever done. It changed me in ways I'm still processing. But I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd let them get away with it. The regret of fighting would have been temporary. The regret of not fighting would have been permanent. An older woman asked, "How do we know when to trust HR? When they're actually there to help us versus when they're protecting the company? You assume they're protecting the company unless proven otherwise," I said bluntly. That's not cynicism. That's realism. HR works for the company, not for you. That doesn't mean they're always adversarial, but it means you need to be strategic about what you share with them and when. Document everything yourself. Talk to an attorney before you file a complaint. Understand that once you involve HR, you've started a process that you can't control. A man in his 40s, someone I vaguely recognized from my time at Meridian, raised his hand. "Tom, some of us were here when this happened. We knew you, and we didn't speak up. We didn't question the story we were told. I want to apologize for that." I looked at him, saw genuine remorse in his expression. "I appreciate that, and I want you to know that I understand why you stayed silent. Speaking up could have cost you your job, your livelihood. The system is designed to make silence the rational choice. But I hope you'll think about what kind of workplace you want to create going forward. One where people feel safe speaking up. One where questioning authority is valued rather than punished. You can't change the past, but you can influence the future." After the session ended, people came up to talk to me individually. Some apologized. Some shared their own stories of witnessing or experiencing misconduct. Some asked for specific advice about situations they were facing. Catherine Park pulled me aside. "Thank you for doing this. I know it wasn't easy." It wasn't, but it was necessary. We're implementing a lot of changes based on what we learned from your case and others. Independent ethics hotline, mandatory training on retaliation and whistleblower protections, separation of HR reporting lines from operational management. It's not perfect, but we're trying. That's all anyone can do. Try. And keep trying even when it's hard. Leaving Meridian Solutions that day, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't felt when the settlement was finalized. This was closure, not in the sense of forgetting or forgiving everything, but in the sense of having said what needed to be said, of having faced the institution that had wronged me and helped it understand what it had done. The following week, I got an email from Sarah Chen, the woman I'd helped 3 years earlier when she'd been facing her own wrongful termination. Her case had eventually settled favorably, and she'd since found a new position where she was thriving. "I wanted you to know that I just accepted a position as Director of Employee Relations at a tech company," she wrote. "I'm going to be the person who investigates complaints, who decides how the company responds to allegations of misconduct. And I'm going into this role with everything I learned from my own experience and from watching how you fought. I'm going to be the HR person I wished I'd had when I needed help. Someone who actually investigates rather than protecting the institution. Someone who understands that employees are human beings, not liabilities. Someone who remembers what it felt like to be powerless and uses that memory to advocate for people who are currently in that position. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to transform trauma into purpose. Thank you for using your experience to help people like me. and thank you for never letting bitterness override your fundamental decency." Reading that email, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not vindication, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more profound. Peace. 5 years after my world had collapsed in that conference room, I'd built something new. Not better, necessarily, not the life I'd planned or expected, but meaningful, purposeful, aligned with values that actually mattered. I'd learned that silence could be sharp, but that speaking could be sharper. I'd learned that justice was possible, but never guaranteed. I'd learned that fighting changes you, that you can't go through a battle without becoming someone different. But I'd also learned that transformation doesn't have to be destructive, that the hardness you develop in one context can be channeled into strength in another, that the person you become in response to trauma can still be someone worth being. I was 48 years old when I learned that silence could be sharper than any word I might have spoken. I was 53 when I learned that the right words, spoken at the right time, could be sharper still, and somewhere in between, I learned that I was strong enough to survive my own transformation. That I could become someone harder and colder and more calculating, and still find my way back to something resembling humanity. That evening, I called Rachel. "How did it go?" she asked. "It went well. Scary but cathartic. I'm proud of you." "You keep saying that. I'll keep saying it until you believe it." I smiled. Maybe I'm starting to. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony and watched the sun set over the city. Somewhere out there, someone was being betrayed by their employer. Someone was weighing whether to fight or accept. Someone was discovering capacities they didn't know they had. I couldn't help all of them. I couldn't fix the system that created these situations. But I could tell my story. I could share what I'd learned. I could be a voice saying that fighting is possible, that silence isn't the only option, that justice exists even if it's imperfect. It wasn't enough, but it was something. And after 5 years of fighting, of transforming, of learning to live with who I'd become, something was enough.